Hey folks, do you ever have issues with your razors getting nicks, cuts, irritation, and they're so expensive for such a cheap product? Well, that's why you have to move over to Henson Shaving. Henson Shaving is a family-owned aerospace parts manufacturer that has made parts for the ISS, the International Space Station, and Mars rover, and now they are bringing precision engineering to your shaving experience. Razor blades are like diving boards. The longer the board, the more wobble. The more wobble, the more nicks, cuts, and scrapes. A bad shave isn't a blade problem, it's an extension problem. By using aerospace-grade CNC machines, Henson makes metal razors that extend just 0.0013 inches, which is less than the thickness of a human hair. That means a secure and stable blade with a vibration-free shave. It gets better. The razor has built-in channels to evacuate hair and cream, which makes clogging virtually impossible. Seriously, Henson Shaving wants the best razor, not the best razor business. They're not gouging you. That means no plastic, no subscriptions, no proprietary blades, and no planned obsolescence. The Henson razor works with standard dual-edge blades to give you that old-school shave with the benefits of new-school tech. Once you own a Henson razor, it's only about $3 to $5 per year to replace the blades. I got this for my fiance. He says he's never going back. In particular, just because like the idea that you have this nice razor, it shaves you better, less irritation, less of that redness and those ingrown hairs. And it's just cheaper in the long run because you just don't have to go to the drugstore and pick up those overpriced razor blades with like 5 different blades on it, but it doesn't give you the same shave that this gives you because of the technology that Henson uses. It's a really great investment and it saves you money in the long run. It's time to say no to subscriptions and yes to a razor that will last you a lifetime. Visit hensonshaving.com/majority to pick up the razor for you and use code majority, and you'll get 2 years worth of blades free with your razor. Just make sure to add them to your cart. That's 100 free blades when you head to hensonshaving.com/majority. That's HENSON shaving.com/majority. Use code majority at checkout. And now, time for the show.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
And I get the feeling you've been cheated.
It is Thursday, April 11th, 2024. My name is Emma Vigeland, in for Sam Seder, and this is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Brett Christophers, author of The Price is Wrong, Why Capitalism Won't Save the Planet. And later in the show, Ronnie Chatah will be with us to talk about Israel's attacks on Lebanon and that history there. Also on the program today, Arizona Republicans block Democratic efforts to repeal the Civil War-era abortion ban after the state Supreme Court upheld it. Florida polling shows strong support for an abortion ballot measure in the fall. They need 60%, but could drive turnout. Samantha Power says famine is underway in Gaza, the first senior Biden official to say so publicly. The U.S. and Israel brace for retaliation for Israel's attacks on the Iranian consulate. Hamas says it does not have 40 living hostages to meet Israel's stated demands on a ceasefire. More and more indications that this military response had very little to do with hostage safety. This comes after the IDF kills Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh's 3 sons. Not him, but his 3 sons who were in Gaza. Haniyeh was in Qatar. Biden is moving forward on closing the gun show loophole via executive action. Trump's efforts to delay his hush money trial fail for the 3rd time, as his ex-CFO Alan Weisselberg is sentenced to 5 months in Rikers for perjury in the fraud case. Biden tells reports he's considering ending the prosecution of Julian Assange. That's good news. House GOP hardliners kill Mike Johnson's efforts to revive an expiring warrantless surveillance law, stumbling into doing something good for once, mostly because Trump told them to do so. Iowa follows Texas's lead, giving itself the clearly unconstitutional authority to deport people. And lastly, O.J. Simpson's dead. Dead.
That was the first news story I was conscious of as a young child. The chase. I remember it on TV. Someone could look it up. What year was that? 93, 92?
97 or 93?
We'll have to look it up.
All right. Well, all this and more on today's Majority Report. I mean, it was after the Rodney King beatings, I think a few years later, right? So are we talking 94, 95, 96?
The riots were 1992, so I think 94.
June 1994, yep.
Got
so
it,
that
okay.
was the first I remember being conscious of a little thing called news.
Yeah, right after the Rangers won the Stanley Cup. I mean, those two things are connected, and right after I was born. So 30 years ago. 30 years
Level
ago.
of importance not in order.
I know.
Where it goes.
But I marked
Emma's
those
birth,
things.
Rangers, Stanley Cup.
I
Okay.
remember some of those historical events you hear about, like around, in 1994, around your birthday. I mean, Kurt Cobain died in April 1994.
Didn't make a big impression on me, I must say.
It did not. I mean, I was a huge Kurt Cobain fan. I read
At that age?
at age 1 month.
9
No,
months.
not quite. But later on, I read that book, a biography of him, Heavier Than Heaven, by Charles Cross, I think his name is. Not to be confused with the offensive tackle for the Seattle Seahawks. Oh my God, my brain has so much useless information. I read that like over and over
Both
again.
Charles Crosses, yes.
Yes, his name was Charles Cross. There you go. Look at that. God. On my deathbed, I'm just going to be able to say, like, who
There
the
were 2
4th string
Charles
wide
Crosses.
receiver was, but I won't be able to remember my kids' names or something like that. That'll be how I perish here. I don't know what sparked that existential
So
crisis.
OJ, and Sam has nothing to do with it.
OJ's dead.
Sam has nothing to do with it as far as...
Yes, as far as we know. As far as we know. Let's talk about this here. This is a good thing. Some good news for once, I think. The Senate Banking Committee held hearings yesterday centered around student loan servicers, particularly the Missouri Higher Education Loan Authority, known as MOHELA. Elizabeth Warren is the committee chair. She does good work in this area and has made student loan debt pretty central to her time in the Senate over the past few years, was a part of pressuring the Biden administration to act on student loan debt. And as you know, I'm sure by now, his efforts to cancel $10,000 for people making less than $125K, up to $20,000 for Pell Grant recipients, that was overturned by the Supreme Court. And MOHELA, this Missouri Higher Education Loan Authority, was involved in that case. You might remember from last summer, the state of Missouri was one of the plaintiffs saying that they were harmed by student loan cancellation in Biden v. Nebraska. And
The parasite bureaucracy?
yeah. And what was amazing about this too, and what just goes to show how much of a joke the Supreme Court is that MOHELA, that organization, even though they're extremely unethical, as you're going to see in a bit, they were they didn't feel that they were harmed by student debt cancellation, even though Missouri claimed that they were, that this would affect their ability to repay the state, because MOHELA is a quasi-state agency. It basically acts as a student loan servicer, as a company, but it has these ties to the state. Missouri made this claim on their behalf, saying that they were going to be harmed financially, and that was why there was standing to claim that student debt cancellation would be in some way harmful financially to their interests. But all of these independent reports, analysis, even, indications from MOHELA themselves show that they were probably actually going to gain financially from student debt cancellation, because it had something to do with certain liabilities going away from MOHELA. All that being said, they're back in the news because the at issue here were their failures surrounding the return to repayment following the student debt payment moratorium in the pandemic. And as you'll hear in this testimony here, they were engaging in practices where they clearly didn't value the material realities of the borrowers. They were funneling them into kind of automated systems, sending them incorrect balances to millions of borrowers who relied on them to be the middleman for like this incredibly financially precarious situation for so many people in this country. And it's just another example of like these parasitic middlemen in this economy that we've created, exploiting people and not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And so this is Persis Yu. She is a part of the Student Borrower Protection Center. And she talks about this report that just came out about MOHELA and the issues surrounding the student loan servicer. But it's not just MOHELA as a boogeyman. Obviously, this is a broader problem.
So much better for it. Earlier this week, the president unveiled further details of his plans to enact debt relief using authority under the Higher Education Act, which could benefit 30 million borrowers. But we know that this unprecedented progress and momentum is gravely threatened by the same servicers that get paid hundreds of millions of dollars to help borrowers manage their payments. The Student Borrower Protection Center and the AFT put out a report we call the MOHELA Papers, which uncovers evidence from a years-long investigation into MOHELA, the primary servicer responsible for the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, and the same servicer that was central in the Supreme Court case that robbed 40+ million borrowers of debt relief. We found that at a time when tens of millions of borrowers are stretching their budgets and struggling to navigate a complicated and changing student loan system, more than 4 in 10 MOHELA customers experienced a servicing failure. Instead of performing basic servicing functions, such as providing borrowers with access to correct and timely information, MOHELA chose a complex call deflection scheme, a Byzantine loop of misinformation and false promises. As the sole servicer administering the PSLF program, MOHELA's servicing failures particularly harm public service workers and prevent them from getting relief. Most recent federal records show that under MOHELA, the backlog of unprocessed forms grew, exceeding at points 1.2 million forms and persisting for several reporting periods at more than 800,000 forms. Public service workers with eligible employment are getting denied. MOHELA sent incorrect bills to more than 250,000 borrowers and failed to send bills at all to more than 2 million borrowers, pushing 800,000 borrowers into delinquency. The call deflection scheme diverts borrowers away from customer service representatives, often to non-operative parts of MOHELA's website. Many of the servicing functions borrowers reach out for can only be performed by a live person. For low-income borrowers, this could be the difference between hundreds, if not thousands, of dollars over this next year. Amidst a time of unprecedented confusion and uncertainty, millions of borrowers reached out only to be led astray. Today, you will hear from industry lobbyists paid to offer spin, point fingers, and attempt to shield MOHELA from public scrutiny. They will claim they do not have sufficient resources. But since the pandemic started, Mohila tripled the size of its portfolio. Make no mistake, Mohila made choices and must be held accountable for them. But Mohila is just the latest bad actor. Borrower advocates, federal and state regulators, law enforcement officials, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau have all documented a history of servicing misconduct and widespread failures across the industry. These failures create obstacles to repayment, raise costs, cause distress, and drive borrowers to default. The department has taken some actions to hold Mohila accountable. However, these actions fail to provide full and adequate remedy to those borrowers who have been harmed. And critically, they do not hold the company's executives accountable. Several states have consumer protection laws that should prevent unfair and deceptive practices, but servicers, Mohila included, often attempt to evade accountability by asserting that these laws don't apply to them, claiming consumer protections are preempted by the Higher Education Act and they are shielded from liability through sovereign immunity. Today's hearing is an opportunity to hold Mohila accountable. And while Mohila's CEO could not muster the courage to appear before you today publicly, I point your attention to the borrowers in this room, at this table and right behind me. These borrowers have taken time out of their busy lives, traveled away from their families to be here in hopes that this body will believe their lived experiences and bring an end to Mohila's cycle of scandal, deception, and borrower abuse. It is time to cancel student debt. It is time to make college free, and it is time to fire Mohila. Thank you.
So well said. Her testimony there, I thought, very succinctly explains exactly why. I mean, these student loan servicers are such vampires, but in particular, why I think Mohila is at the center for some of these activists, and I saw the Debt Collective make this point, which is that the standing that I referred to earlier in the Supreme Court case, it was a joke on its face, obviously, because of the fact that Mohila actually stood to benefit financially from student debt cancellation. But the reason that they were even able to make that threadbare argument is because of the semi-quasi-state governmental entity status that Mohila possesses. So the Debt Collective and others are urging Biden to terminate contracts with Mohila because then future lawsuits surrounding the student debt cancellation would not be able to rely on that same standing, claiming that this particular student debt organization servicer, or student loan servicer, I should say, is in some way a government entity where you can claim standing here. So this is an attempt to pressure the Biden administration to terminate these kinds of contracts. Because then once you see the reality and these completely private student loan servicers are put in the headlights, or put in the spotlight, I think, put in the spotlight, that's better. Then you're able to kind of isolate them too. What?
I'd like to see him in between two headlights too, but
yes.
I mean, this industry grinds people down, and I think that testimony got close, but I don't think a lot of the elite politicians understand, especially people from low incomes, how this industry grinds people down by millions with this sort of Kafka-esque BS about, okay, how do I even get in the right sort of repayback plan for me? Am I actually getting any sort of human engagement here? And then to the extent that it breaks people through it, people suffer through it in shame, in silence. And so the Debt Collective and people like this are speaking for those people. I mean, one, it shows just how massive this problem is. Mm-hmm. And again, I just, it's long past time, because the longer that we tolerate these half measures with the idea that this sort of student loan is a concept that should not exist. Yeah. No bankers or financiers should be taking a cut on people getting an education. It's sick that we allow that to be just a natural part of education in this society. Literally, rich people get an interest on poor people educating themselves. How are we allowing that?
And it's driving up the price of colleges broadly. I saw that Vanderbilt University might reach $100,000 a year in tuition. And this gatekeeps these elite institutions for already existing wealthy people. And so it completely
And if you're not wealthy, you're going to have to pay. You're going to have to pound of flesh to these behemoth organizations, and you're going to be paying that the entire career.
And it's not just pound of flesh too. It's also you're selling your future prospects and your future, like say you're 18 and you take out these student loans so you can go to Vanderbilt, $100,000 a year. You're hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt when you graduate. What are you going to do? Are you going to go work and be a teacher or a professor?
No.
Or somebody that works for a nonprofit?
They work for Chevron.
You're going to work at the highest, and that is the point. That is the point. So
exactly, they win-win.
It protects these institutions and makes them.
Parasites get to feed off it, and corporations get their workforce.
Yep, and it furthers wealth inequality for people who can afford it. It gatekeeps for the rest of society, and then for people that go into debt to be a part of those institutions, it funnels those people into useful positions for capitalism. All right, folks, we are going to be talking to Brett Christophers in just a second, but first, a word from our sponsors. Everybody that knows me knows I love cashews, but I don't want them, feeling processed, overly salty, and nuts.com is none of that. I've got to say, their cashews are a 10 out of 10, so much so that Sam Seder went to my desk when I wasn't in the office and took them, and then lied about it. I'm just going to start eating them
in the middle of this ad.
I know. I don't have any left. Disgusting. Just another boss feeding off their work.
So another suppressive boss.
Yeah, exactly. They are so good, cashews, though. And nuts.com is really your one-stop shop for all snacks. Please join me in thanking nuts.com for supporting the Majority Report. Right now, when you go to nuts.com/majority, new customers get a free gift with purchase and free shipping on orders of $29 or more. Nuts.com is your one-stop shop for freshly roasted nuts, dried fruits, sweets, pantry staples like specialty flours, and more. Their wide selection means that there is something for everyone. Nuts.com offers plenty of gluten-free options, organic choices, and other diet-friendly products. Whether you're looking for something sweet, savory, or need to stock up on everyday cooking essentials, you are bound to find something to try. At Nuts.com, quality is top priority. They roast their nuts and pop their corn the same day it ships, so it reaches you deliciously fresh. Satisfaction is guaranteed. Shop a la carte at any time or opt into hassle-free auto deliveries so you never run out of your favorite items. This is what I gotta do. And you're already stocked up at home, so if you're already stocked up at home, I should say, they also sell directly to businesses and have a bunch of great options.
Did you hear that?
I know. Right now, Nuts.com is offering new customers a free gift with purchase and free shipping on orders of $29 or more at nuts.com/majority. So go check out all of the delicious options at nuts.com/majority. You'll receive a free gift and free shipping when you spend $29 or more. That's nuts.com/majority, nuts.com/majority. And lastly, Fast Growing Trees, a favorite of the green-thumbed Samuel Seder. Did you know that Fast Growing Trees is the biggest online nursery in the U.S. with more than 10,000 different kinds of plants and over 2 million happy customers in the U.S.? I got an indoor plant from them, one of those nice vine ones that hangs off your bookshelf that, everybody in Brooklyn seems to have. But I like the aesthetic, and it's lasted a very long time. It shipped right to me, and it looked great as soon as you were able to pot it because Fast Growing Trees ships them to you when they're a little bit more developed. And
How does it arrive?
It's immediate gratification. What'd you say?
How did it arrive?
It arrived in this cardboard padded thing that protected it. It was a really small plant, so I can't speak to the bigger ones.
Trees.
But I think Sam can because he has I've been hearing about those bloomerangs that he has and that he's planted. And you don't need to have a yard or a ton of space. You can grow lemon, avocado, olive, or fig trees inside your home on top of the wide variety of houseplants available. The experts at Fast Growing Trees curate thousands of plants so you can find the perfect fit for your specific climate, location, and needs. You don't have to drive around to nurseries and big gardening centers. Fast Growing Trees makes it easy to order online, and your plants are shipped to your door in 1 to 2 days. Whether you're looking to add some privacy, shade, or natural beauty to your yard, Fast Growing Trees has in-house experts ready to help you make the right selection with growing and care advice available 24/7. You can talk to a plant expert about your soil type, landscape design, how to take care of your plants, and everything else you need. No green thumb required, but if you have one, it's a great place to go. This spring, they have the best deals online, up to half off on select plants and other deals. And listeners to our show get an additional 15% off their first purchase when using the code MAJORITY at checkout. That's an additional 15% off at fastgrowingtrees.com using the code MAJORITY at checkout. Fastgrowingtrees.com, code MAJORITY. Offer is valid for a limited time. Terms and conditions may apply. All right, quick break, folks, and then we'll be back with Brett Christophers. We are back, and we are joined now by Brett Christophers, professor in the Institute for Housing and Urban Research at Sweden's Uppsala University. I hope I didn't butcher that. And the author of The Price is Wrong, Why Capitalism Won't Save the Planet. Brett, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me on.
So, I wasn't expecting this when I picked up your book, because you don't typically see people who have a background in consulting have any kind of regard for the planet. I don't mean to be over the top about it, but we've talked about consultants on this show before, and how they can be these hired guns for corporations to cut costs. But how did your background as a management consultant inform your research and your work on this topic?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. You're right that I spent around 8 years in management strategy consulting, which was a while back. And ever since then, I've been an academic. And actually, while it didn't take me long in that world to realize that world wasn't ultimately for me. It was an incredibly valuable period. And actually, I would argue that many of the most important things I learned about capitalism and the way capitalism works, I learned from when I was a consultant, being kind of, so to speak, within the belly of the beast. I learned a heck of a lot more then than I have done, in a way, subsequently, looking at capitalism from the outside as a kind of external analyst. Being part of it on a day-to-day basis was incredibly instructive, even if not ultimately for me as a career.
What were some of those instructive pieces? I mean, what did you take away from that time?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of it, to be honest, was really sort of basic stuff, but the sort of stuff that many people working outside of that world just don't know. Just really basics, like reading company balance sheets and understanding how capitalist businesses work on a day-to-day basis, and what kind of things work and what kind of thing doesn't. I mean, it sounds very mundane and very banal, but actually incredibly important. And I've carried that with me through all of my career. And as I say, it sounds very basic, but I actually think it's quite fundamental.
That's throughout your book. I mean, it's inherent to it. It serves also as a bit of a myth buster about what motivates capital investment, right? I mean, it's
absolutely.
There's this romantic notion of these upstart businesses. If you have a good idea, I mean, you're going to get some investment and someone's going to see it, and then you can grow it into this large business. But, renewable energies are good ideas. Renewable energies have shown a lot of promise. And your book talks about how the perception of what the incentives are for investment in that, it's not exactly true, a lot of what people assume.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I think that, put it this way, there are many people and institutions and companies out there that are, often for the best reasons imaginable, are keen to develop new renewable energy facilities, new solar farms and wind farms and so on. But the reality is that for every, let's say for every 100 ideas for projects that are out there, only a handful ever proceed to development. Now, there's a very common conception out there that the biggest obstacle for those developments that don't ultimately make it is because they don't get planning permission, they don't get the permits they need, they don't get the grid connection and so on. But the reality is that in most cases, the obstacle is that those entities are not able to raise the financing they need to proceed. And that's because back of those developers, there are hard-nosed financial institutions that look at those project proposals and they say, well, you've got a great idea here, but the reality is that the renewable electricity business is incredibly volatile business most of the time. Profitability is pretty thin most of the time. And so while we might salute your objectives here, the reality is that we're not convinced that you'll be able to pay back the money that we need to loan you to get the development off the ground. And as I say, and that takes me all the way back to that work in consulting, whereas it's exactly that kind of hard-nosed financial viability analysis that is undertaken on a day-to-day basis that really is at the root of contemporary capitalism.
And so, I mean, it's the root of it too is just in the same way that a lot of other industries work, right? Where people are trying to invest or get returns that are sure things, and that they're trying to make sure that their boss doesn't get mad at them, or that they're able to make as much money as possible, as opposed to, as I said earlier, this kind of romantic notion of investing in this exciting technology. Can you contrast like what an investment in a traditional energy source would look like for somebody's portfolio versus taking a risk on some of these renewable energies that don't necessarily have that consistent profit or the fatter returns that would draw people in?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that one of the contrasts that I like to draw, because I think it's a contrast that a lot of people can relate to, and it's obviously a very important contrast, would be between kind of the traditional oil and gas business, on the one hand, the business of the likes of Chevron and Exxon and so on, and the business of renewable energy development, developing solar and wind farms and selling the electricity that they generate on the other hand. Now, the former of those is, at least in recent years, for quite a consistent period of time now, has been a very high return business. Typically those companies don't get out of bed and don't even consider proceeding with projects if they don't think they're going to be able to get returns of at least 15% on those types of projects. Whereas in the renewable energy world, you're lucky if you get 6, 7, 8% returns. So it's a much lower profit business. Now, in underlying terms, both of them are volatile, but one of the things that you find in the oil and gas business that you don't find in the renewables business is that they're over a considerable period of time, they have developed various institutional structures, institutional mechanisms to try to mitigate that volatility. And so the best example of that would be OPEC, right? OPEC is nothing if not a price fixing cartel. And if there's any concern in the global oil market that prices are going down, OPEC calls a halt to production in certain parts of the OPEC world and asks for production quotas to be railed back. And so there are these mechanisms that exist to maintain pricing and profits when they are threatened. Now, the renewable electricity world is a completely different world in most parts of the world, where those sorts of mechanisms don't exist. It's an incredibly competitive world. Generating companies are selling their electricity into incredibly competitive wholesale markets for the buying and selling of electricity. And so those mechanisms for the mitigation of volatility don't exist to anything like the same extent. And that scares off investors. Investors like to see predictability of returns and of profits. And in the renewables world, those forms of predictability and stability are quite hard to find. They do exist, but they tend to be provided by governments rather than by within market mechanisms, so to speak.
And I mean, it almost the OPEC example is such a great one, right? Because it's basically capital reaching a certain threshold, and where you get to a certain level of power, where then there's colluding and price fixing that can go on, and it's accepted, but then it reinforces itself, because then there's that built-in stability just by the amount of money that we're talking about here, and the fact that those players can throw their weight around, that it congeals, right? I mean, it's almost as if, right, go on.
It does, and and the thing that it does, I think, that's probably most important, is that it provides continuing incentives for investment in that sector, right? If prospective developers of new oil and gas resources can see that the price volatility in oil markets has reduced over time because of the efficacy of institutions like OPEC, then it's very easy for them to take the decisions to make that investment. But in a sector where that confidence and that predictability doesn't exist, then it's much harder for the necessary financing to be raised. And I think that and I think that's where you are in the renewables market globally, is that you're in a situation now where not least with interest rates having gone up and with supply chain costs having gone up, there is a great degree of hesitancy amongst financial institutions in particular to provide the financing that renewables developers require in order to proceed with those developments. And I think that's precisely why you see things like the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, which is a situation where over time, the level of the tax credits that the US government had been providing to wind and solar developers had been going down over time. There was generally a confidence in government that you could kind of wean the industry off those subsidies because of declining technology costs and all the rest of it. But what happened as those subsidies got reduced was that investment began to stagnate. And I think the Inflation Reduction Act, more than anything else, was a recognition that the industry, at least right now, can't do without significant levels of support and subsidy because of that volatility and because of the lack of confidence in financial institutions to support that industry in the absence of those subsidy mechanisms.
And so it does basically, even though the Inflation Reduction Act is a pro-capitalist bill, it's about spurring investment by giving these tax credits. It hasn't created the desired effect based on what you're saying, which means perhaps a heavier state hand would be more appropriate to speed this along, given the severity of what we're seeing.
Well, let's put it this way. I think it's too early still to make a call on the efficacy of the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, it didn't come into force and obviously until late in 2022. We're still early in 2024. And I think the data to tell whether it's had the desired effect that remains to be seen. I think one of the other things worth saying, just to your point, is absolutely it's a pro-capitalist act. I mean, it is about providing confidence in the desired level of profitability in order for investment to go ahead. Is that a good or a bad thing? Well, it depends on where you're coming from. I mean, if you were to ask me, look, if the choice is between, on the one hand, renewable energy development proceeding very, very rapidly and lots of big firms making lots of profits off the back of that development, on the one hand, or on the other hand, the necessary levels of profitability not being available and capitalists not therefore investing and therefore renewable energy development not occurring at speed and at scale, then I would take the first option every time. But of course, in the wider political economic scheme of things, those are not the only two choices. We live in a world where in most parts of the world, including the US, the energy transition has essentially been outsourced to the private sector and to markets. Governments have essentially said, look, we expect you, the private sector, to do this, to take the lead. Our role will be one of providing incentives and nudges and support mechanisms as and where we think they are necessary to enable you to do your job. But that's not the only world of possibilities, right? The government could do other things. It could, theoretically at least, become much more active in actually proceeding with renewable energy development itself, financing, investing, operating those sorts of resources on its own terms, rather than simply relying on incentivizing the private sector. So I think there are wider possibilities out there. The extent to which those are credible in the current political economic environment is another question.
Certainly. But I mean, it occurs to me that if we have these utilities that could be a great place to start, where state hands, it might not necessarily fly in the face or cause Fox News to scream communism at the top of their lungs or something to that effect. Like, there could be tweaks within the quasi-public utility sectors that I feel haven't necessarily been explored, and I know you touch on this a bit.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that many viewers won't necessarily be aware of is the fact that even within the US, there are huge differences in how the electricity sector is organized geographically across the country. So in some parts of the country, the classic utility model that you're referring to doesn't really exist anymore. So the classic utility would be a situation where one entity within a particular geographical area owns the whole electricity supply chain. So they generate the electricity, they own the infrastructure through which that electricity is transmitted and distributed, and they sell the electricity to households. There are some parts of the country in which that model still exists. The Southeast is probably the best example of that, so including Florida. But there are large parts of the country where that model has been swept away, and where instead of that, you have kind of a separate generation sector. So you have independent production companies that generate the electricity, and then you have other entities that distribute it, and other entities still that sell it to consumers. And Texas, California, New England are very good examples of that. And I think you're right that the traditional utility model, in a way, offers options that are different and potentially preferable to the kind of disaggregated model that the country has been moving towards. If you are a utility company that owns the whole supply chain, then in a way you have a much more coordinated business. You can align what's going on in the generation sector with what's going on in distribution and retail in a way that isn't really possible when you have these autonomous actors that are controlling different parts of the supply chain. But here's the thing, right, which is that in those parts of the country where the utilities still exist, they have their own conventional power plants that have traditionally applied those that have supplied the electricity, whether that's coal or natural gas fired plants or both of them. The cost involved in those are sunk costs. They've already experienced those costs. So they have an interest in exploiting those existing generating assets until the end of their useful life, rather than potentially investing in new generating resources. And so there are arguments, both positive and negative, for both of those models, if you see what I mean, both for the traditional utility model, but also for the newer separate generating sector model.
Yes, I mean, and I think that's in part due to the very disjointed nature of it here in the United States that you describe. There have been the Texas electricity model, and its very privatized model, is notorious, at least on this program, for its inefficiencies and its gouging and all of that. But I guess then the kind of final question here to wrap things up is how can we incentivize or push governments to act and with the urgency that would be necessary to combat climate change, outside of trying to get investors, markets to move in their direction? Because the prospect of just the cheapness of the electricity, of renewable energy, is not moving things, right? So,
No. I mean that's right. I mean, the argument at the core of the book is the fact that it has become increasingly cheap to generate electricity through solar and wind resources is not enough economically if actors are not incentivized to invest in the development of those resources in the first place. And there are significant problems around those incentives, not least relating to the points about volatility that we talked about earlier. It's not only about volatility, but volatility is a key part of that. So that, as you say, that raises the question of what can be done about it, and in particular, what governments can do. I mean, I think there are three broad answers to that question. And you tend to hear those answers from three different constituencies. So the answer that you get from kind of mainstream energy economists, what they say is that the problem is not that we're relying on the private sector and markets. They would argue that the problem is that we haven't got the market design right. So they would say, look, the problem, we need to stick with reliance on the private sector and markets, but we just need to tinker with the way in which electricity is bought and sold. We need to change the incentive mechanisms. We need to change the so-called merit order model through which electricity is priced in wholesale markets. And if we get the market design right, everything else will flow from that. I'm incredibly skeptical of that argument because that's the classic kind of neoliberal argument, which is that the answer to problems created by marketization is not something other than markets. It's simply more markets or better markets. It's the classic neoliberal argument for which there's no fundamental evidence at all. So that's the first answer. The second answer, which is the answer you hear from industry, and which is the one you've alluded to, is which is they say, look, we need to stick with exactly the existing model where governments are there to support industry and subsidize industry. And we can stick with exactly the same market design we have at the moment. We just need more subsidy. That's essentially what's happened with the Inflation Reduction Act. Government has responded to industry concerns that the subsidies are not sufficient to drive development of renewables at the pace we need. That's the second answer. The third answer is that actually, the problem is with relying on private sector and markets. And as far as I see it, a larger government role, including government investment in and ownership of renewable resources on a much larger scale than either exists at the moment or is being contemplated, would be one possibility for that. Now, the answer you will get from opponents of that idea is, no, governments are operating under huge fiscal constraints. They have to be fiscally conservative. Governments need to tighten their belts. Well, the reality is that the public sector, not least in the US, is still able to borrow more cheaply than the private sector is. And it's not like it would be borrowing to invest in resources that aren't revenue generating. It would be borrowing to invest in resources that are revenue generating. They might not be profitable enough to attract private investment, but you would hope and imagine that the public sector would be willing to invest in resources where the returns are only 5% or so, if the private sector isn't willing to do that. So I think there is an argument for that type of public sector role, which frankly was right at the heart of the Green New Deal proposals as they were originally articulated both in the US and in the UK. So I think there is an alternative there, but those would be the kind of three broad answers that are out there at the moment.
The book is really fascinating. It's called The Price is Wrong, Why Capitalism Won't Save the Planet. Brett Christophers, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right, folks, quick break. And when we come back, we are going to be speaking to Ronnie Chatah about Lebanon and Israel's recent attacks on southern Lebanon and the history of it as well. Be right back. We are back, and we are joined now by Ronnie Chatah, writer, host of the Beirut Banyan, and founder of Walk Beirut. Ronnie, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
It's an honor.
So,
And I'd like to say I'd never imagined being associated with O.J. Simpson in any geopolitical context. So that makes the occasion a bit stranger.
yes. I mean, we have to acknowledge that he died, but I don't really know what other commentary I have about it except
maybe we'll focus a little bit on Nicole Brown a little bit later.
Yes.
But yeah,
but you know, the reference to Kurt Cobain is actually timely as well. They're roughly around the same period, the early 90s. For political purposes, this is around the time Arab-Israeli peace becomes political discourse as well. So perhaps it does tie into the story.
It does. Thank you for making me more thematically consistent than my actual commentary engenders. But I really appreciate you coming on, Ronnie. I'll start here. What has life in Lebanon been like since October 7th? Israel has been striking southern Lebanon basically since shortly after Hamas's attack. I guess, what's it been like, and how does it feel to kind of be in such close proximity to all this violence?
For better or worse, in Lebanon, this is familiar territory. This isn't the first time Lebanon has been impacted by a regional war. Case in point today, Israel and Hamas and Gaza, the spillover into Lebanon. But this is how I grew up in this country. In the 1990s, this is very familiar. Except it was over a long period of time, and we grew accustomed to it. There would be Israeli attacks sometimes on a daily basis post-Civil War Lebanon. So that's really the 90s, primarily until Israel withdrew in 2000. But that decade, we saw two things happen, which kind of segues back to today. A smaller group that was primarily in the background of Lebanese politics, emerging into a sub-state proxy, which is Hezbollah, and today dictating two things, state sovereignty and also politics. So we have right now in 2024 is familiarity in regional war, but at least with Lebanon, something a little different, which is Hezbollah's ascendance to politics and de facto control.
Yes, let's turn then to Hezbollah and their origins. Much like Hamas, Hezbollah wouldn't exist without Israel. And can you talk about how Hezbollah came to be and its relationship to the state of Israel?
Sure. So post 1982, Israel's invasion of Beirut and its siege of Beirut, Ariel Sharon and Yasser Arafat, names that belong to the 90s as well. We don't talk about them today. Arafat is dislodged from Lebanon. Arafat and the PLO, and particularly the Fatah militia, more or less considered Lebanon home from 1970 until 1982. Post 1982, with Arafat's departure to Tunis, the PLO becomes a non-party to Lebanon's civil war. It becomes inactive when it comes to the broader security problems Lebanon went through. That's around the same time the Iranian Revolution happens, and the Iranian regime changes into a de facto, over time, theocracy with a military bend, a military dictatorship with a theocratic facade. And its primary objective in the early 1980s was, I think, and this is my understanding of Hezbollah, is trying to seek leverage in a country like Lebanon back then, today throughout the region, but primarily in Lebanon, to have what would emerge over time as not just a resistance force that was fighting the Israelis successfully. And I think it's important to remember as well that Hezbollah is a feared entity among Israeli scholars, Israeli soldiers. People talk about Hezbollah not with a joking manner. They take this group seriously. But it grew, and it grew to becoming more than a resistance force against Israel's then occupation of what remained of the South Lebanon, into something else. Post-2000, with Israel's withdrawal from Lebanon, minus the demarcation of the blue line, which is the de facto border between Lebanon and Israel, Hezbollah grew. And Hezbollah took, in a way, it inherited two things. It inherited what the PLO had in Lebanon back then in the 1970s and early 80s, which is sub-state autonomy. The Lebanese government does not dictate the terms of what Hezbollah does militarily. It also inherited something else, which we talk about less and less today because it's history. It inherited the Syrian occupation's leverage and security and intelligence. And the Syrian army left in 2005. Of course, since 2005, this is nearly 20 years ago, we've seen Lebanon go from a country free of Syrian and Israeli occupation into remaining a battlefield. And what that battlefield is, I think, depends who you ask. But the de facto situation is that Lebanon is a battlefield right now for this larger Arab-Israeli war. Case in point, what you said earlier, which is true, Lebanese are getting killed. In 2024, this is now 34 years since the civil war's end. Lebanese are still dying through battle. And I think it's also maybe important to remember that despite anniversaries going by over time, we're 49 years since the civil war's start. That's 5 decades. Lebanon should not be in this situation, but unfortunately it is. Hence my point earlier, which is this is very familiar terrain.
Unfortunately so. Can you expand on the nature of the civil war and the role of Palestinian refugees who were expelled from what is now Israel in that particular destabilization?
I'll put it into context as much as I can without boring you or the audience.
Not possible.
Not possible? Good. As somebody who podcasts for a living, I take that for granted.
Yes.
The refugees of this country pay an unfortunate price for geopolitics that has nothing to do with them. Just yesterday, Syrian refugees are being ambushed in the country, falsely associated with another political assassination that happened several days ago. A member of the Lebanese Forces political party was ambushed and killed. His body was dumped in Syria. There is an association that Syrian refugees are to blame, and this is absolutely false. Yet you have Syrian refugees getting beaten up on the streets. And I don't know if you've been to Beirut before, but in case you haven't been here, this is a buzzing city even during darker times. Right now, the reason there's fair quiet in the city is not because of Ramadan or the Eid holiday that's today. It's that there are Syrian workers not on the streets of Beirut, not on the streets at night out of fear. To throw that back to the civil war and the Palestinian refugee dilemma, Palestinian refugees have been living here since 1948. Since the creation of Israel and the dismantlement of the British Mandate of Palestine, these Palestinian refugees have been living in this country primarily as second-class citizens. That may be actually polite to describe them as such. These are descendants of those refugees from 1948. There are some that arrive in 1967 as well, but the bulk, the bigger numbers from 1948, living in refugee camps. And refugee camps, I think, is also maybe complementary. These are more like ghettos. And there are UN agencies that have limited agency to operate within these camps, but not that much. And only until recently, Palestinian refugees could not work in most employment sectors anyway. You have a struggling population that's deprived of their dignity, living in this country as the Arab-Israeli war drags on. That's something important to be mentioned, perhaps in context. There is a huge Arab-Israeli war that is fought in 1967, the June 1967 war that changes the borders of the Middle East. This is when the Golan Heights of Syria are occupied and later annexed by Israel. This is when the West Bank is taken from Jordan, East Jerusalem as well, annexed. This is when the Gaza Strip is taken into Israel from Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula as well. So Israel multiplies, I don't know what, maybe perhaps a third of its territory expands further. It's a huge Lebanon, not one shot is fired across the border between this country and Israel. And that's because this is the time in Lebanon's history where there was enough, just enough, of a neutral policy that was state promoted, and that Lebanon would be spared from regional wars taking place. That was a de facto state policy in the 1960s. We lost that agency long ago. And Arafat's arrival to this country, the PLO's establishment here in this country, changes those conditions forever. You don't have a Lebanese army in control of the Lebanese state, or at least its security and defense, peace and war. Instead, you have a sub-state militia that is dictating those terms. 5 years later, in 1975.
Well, can I pause just for 1 second, just to sit with that for a moment? So this influx of Palestinian refugees expelled in the Nakba, expelled in the decades prior, basically creates destabilization within Lebanon. And now, of course, you say the continued Palestinian refugees are second-class citizens as well. But how many Palestinian refugees came during that time period? And I guess, how did the PLO kind of sap the agency of the Lebanese government and take on so much power within the country?
I appreciate you asking these questions. This is why I come prepared with a pen and paper. Thank you for asking this. It is roughly 100,000 Palestinian refugees that moved from the Galilee, which is northern Israel, northern Palestine, into Lebanon. So roughly 100,000 settle here. I think it's about the same in Syria as well. And the numbers in Jordan escape me now. But 100,000 refugees that flee war and flee the catastrophe, Nakba, end up in Lebanon 22 years before politics changes in this country. So it's 1948. The refugees that live in camps and are deprived of most rights remain refugees, even though the PLO and Fatah is operating in other countries, and it's not their doing here. These refugees are simply suffering in Lebanon, but politics is changing in the region designed for war. It's 1969. That's the year things changed for Lebanon, and when the PLO sets up its base in this country months later. It's called the Cairo Agreement. This is a settlement where Arafat and Fatah are not sustainable to the Jordanian regime. Prior to that, Arafat considered Jordan home. There is a brief civil war in Jordan that spells the end for Arafat's presence in that country. And the Cairo Agreement is an Arab League agreement that more or less suggests a better place for Arafat, which is southern Lebanon, loosely termed back then as Fatah land, meaning that army, that sub-state army, that militia can operate in southern Lebanon to fight Israel. The association with that group, that militia, that infrastructure with refugees, it takes a few years before all hell breaks loose. And that's April 13, 1975. The reason I'm mentioning 1969 and 1975 in the same essence is that it takes a few years for Lebanon to completely break down into outright anarchy. But something happens, which is other militia take hold. There is a reaction, a military-like reaction to Fatah in this country. And suddenly you have names that they're now featured in documentaries, they're mentioned in films altogether, like the Phalange, the Kata'ib militia. These are right-wing Lebanese paramilitary men that decide to arm themselves and fight Fatah in this country too. This is when things spin out of control, and the Lebanese army is really not playing a role. It's in 1975, April 1975, and the marker is a tragic marker. It's a bus attack where Palestinian refugees are killed, moving from one part of the city to the other. And that's the beginning of the civil war.
And what was Israel and the United States' role in this? Did they interfere? Did they allow this to play out? Did they take sides in this Lebanese civil conflict?
I think the de facto U.S. position vis-a-vis the Arab-Israeli struggle, long-term disaster, the century-long tragedy that has ruined politics for the Middle East and made this part of the world ungovernable, is a solid standby, steadfast support for Israel. Back then, there was a Lebanese state that the U.S. had better ties with, and there was a state that they could talk to as well. Not what we have right now, which is almost a shell of a state that panders to geopolitical problems, not to Lebanese interests. But back then, the Lebanese state was a friend to the US for the most part. And actually, it's the American Marines that pay a heavy price in the early 1980s for that steadfast support back then to trying to reconfigure and reconstruct Lebanon during the war. This is a 1980s Marine barracks, and I don't remember the exact numbers, maybe 150, if not more, US soldiers are killed in this country. And the numbers actually could be wrong. It could be much larger than that. But the US Embassy, which used to be in Beirut, is blown up twice. The US Embassy today is not in Beirut. It's in the outskirts of the city. It's almost like a fortress on the hills outside of Beirut. The US policy to Lebanon, this is going back to the Reagan years, this is a long time ago, was that peacekeeping is not going to work. At times, cosmetic strikes, and sorry to use this term this way, cosmetic meaning the USS New Jersey, this was a ship that was parked in the Mediterranean, would sometimes strike in the mountains of Lebanon occasionally. Nothing like Israel's siege into Beirut, nothing like earlier American involvement. There was a distancing. And it wasn't actually, I think it's until the late 1990s, if I'm not mistaken, there was a travel ban on Americans coming to this country. Almost considered a pariah state that was then under Syrian occupation, but disinterest in anything related to this country. What became, and I think remains, a primary concern is Israel's security for America. And that has had deep disadvantages, especially to those trying to not get sucked into, which I think is false binaries, which is you're either supporting Israel or you're not supporting Israel.
Or you're with
either
Iran.
pro-Israel. Exactly. I think Lebanon's interests, which in my opinion, my assessment, are best reflected in the 1960s, where this country doesn't have to pay a price for a huge outrage taking shape in the region. I think that model, that aspiration, I don't see that today as a priority for any US administration, both Republican or Democrat.
Certainly. Although the politics around Israel, I will say, are rapidly changing in this country in a way that I couldn't foresee. But you know, I think that the context of, you know, the settler colonial project of Israel basically creating this incredible destabilization is so key. One, due to the fact that we often hear, why won't the other Arab countries just take these people? I mean, why won't they just take them? There must be something inherently wrong with them. When you see, though, that actually Arab countries, whether it be Jordan, whether it be Syria, whether it be Lebanon, countries in the region did take on many Palestinian refugees after the Nakba. But the continued expansionist aims by Israel have contributed to even more deep stabilization for now 75 years.
You know, it's quite interesting. I think all of these different facts are all accurate, and they shape, I think, how regimes interact with each other in this part of the world. And I'll give you an example. Roughly 10 years ago, the Syrian regime was bombing Palestinian refugee camps in Syria. You have thousands of Palestinian refugees killed by the Assad regime. You have today thousands of Palestinian refugees. What's the number now? 35,000, perhaps more. Palestinian refugees and civilians in Gaza getting killed on a daily basis. I think both are true in that these regimes and Israel's nominal enemies as well, I think, have hijacked this cause and turned it into one that perverts society. It destroys politics, but it also destroys society, especially where divisions are fragile. Case in point is a country like Lebanon, where you have a Palestinian cause, a moral support that is real, and I think that's majority, and that Lebanese look at the suffering of what's happening right now in Gaza and open their hearts and extend their sympathies always. That's the overwhelming majority sentiment. Despite calls to the contrary, I think that is true. What is also true is that this cause can be hijacked. You can have a paramilitary force like Hezbollah, which its raison d'etre is to fight Israel, built to defend Iran's interests, but its raison d'etre is to fight Israel. It has taken a very calculated, very cautious, very defensive approach into supporting Hamas and fighting Israel. And right now, Hezbollah's initiation on the Lebanese side on October 8 is described mostly as one of caution. So I think all of this can be true, and that this cause, first and foremost, has destroyed not just Palestine, but the chances for the Palestinian people to have a normal life. I don't think this is going to happen in our lifetime as well. Speaking about the earlier generation, our generation as well, unfortunately, it seems like this is impossible given the current circumstances. But the ripple effects of that cause and the trajectory of that cause into what looks like politics but is not, it's mostly security and regime survivability, that also destroys not just Palestine, it destroys the neighborhood too, which is why I think over time, the patience for this cause, and especially in a country that is vulnerable to regional war, I think the patience is thinning by the day. And Lebanon today, right now, does not resemble the Lebanon of the 1960s one bit. This is a country that looks increasingly on the brink of civil war once more. That's an unfortunate ripple effect to a regional war being fought outside of its natural borders.
Can you expand a bit more on Hezbollah and what, if you could give an ideological overview of their stated goals, how real the constant connection, a lot of militia groups are defined as Iran-backed proxies in the Western press, and sometimes it's hard to discern how strong those ties are. Hezbollah, pretty strong, but I mean, I guess if what the state of Hezbollah is right now and its origins and its charter.
I'll do my best because it's a great question and it's a dense question. I'll try to make it as simple as possible. It's many things at once. Yes, it is an Iranian proxy. It is a fully sponsored paramilitary force outside of Iran's borders. This is all accurate. It extends from Lebanon into Syria today, even into Iraq at times, and sometimes even into Yemen. That's true. But at the end of the day, it is also made up of Lebanese civilians that are taking part in this sub-state group's mission. Now that mission has evolved. Hezbollah in the 1980s, and its essence really is to push Israel out of Lebanon. For 2 decades or so, that was the cause, that was their cause, getting Israel out of Lebanon. Once Israel left the country in 2000, in May of 2000, the rationale for having that kind of infrastructure in Lebanon, it evolved. We have a sliver of real estate between Lebanon and Israel. It's called the Sheba Farms. Maybe you've come across this in sort of political talks in this part of the world. It's a very small sliver of real estate. No Lebanese live there. It's technically Syrian. It's in the Golan Heights, bordering Lebanon, of course, under Israel occupation and annexation. That has become Hezbollah's geographic reason to stay armed. It doesn't sell well in this country. Post-2005 is really, I think, where the story becomes less about resisting Israel and more about, in my assessment, making sure there's no security threat from Lebanon towards what looks more and more like Iran's leverage in the region based in this country. And the reason I mentioned 2005 is because that is the beginning of a long string of political assassinations that have become the norm in this country. It is just 3 days ago that another politician was killed, but the list is so long and it's diverse. In 2005, it's a former prime minister. His name is Rafiq Hariri. It's his advisor as well, his economic advisor, Basil Fleihan. But over time, you have diplomats, you have intelligentsia, you have journalists getting killed, and this happens increasingly. You have even people working for a UN body, Special Tribunal for Lebanon, that was meant to actually investigate political assassinations. Its verdict pointed at Hezbollah members. But 20 years of that kind of scenario, it's Hezbollah focusing their energy on politics in this country through security, meaning no tangible threat to what they've built here. I'll give you maybe I'm allowed to do this. I hope it's a personal story for me. The guy in the background is my father. He's one of those politicians killed by Hezbollah as well in late 2013. It has impacted so many of us. All of us have lost friends to that long string of political assassinations. We've grown adjusted to it as well. And I think Hezbollah's primary concern right now is finding a narrative that sells because they're deeply unpopular in the country. Even when you have the conditions for their popularity, like the ongoing Hamas-Israel tragedy. They have the conditions for sympathy, but they're not being met. I think over time, Hezbollah lost their narrative and they lost their raison d'etre for Lebanese, yet it seems to not matter. And my understanding is that this is Iranian security first and foremost today. How can Iran and how can that regime best defend its interests outside of its borders and have less exposure to its interests within its borders? I think that's what Hezbollah represents right now. And that's tragic for Lebanon. And that's because it's a Lebanese group made up of Lebanese citizens. And it's harder maybe for the conditions for civil war to return right now. But people are speaking this language. And there's real fear on the streets of Beirut that the spillover to this long-term problem can turn into something very ugly. And it's a reminder of what Lebanon went through.
And it's a reminder of how Israel's continued belligerence and the knock-on effects of it have resulted, and the United States too. I mean, Iran and our coup there, right, has resulted in less democracy in the Middle East. Lebanon, now with this Hezbollah kind of takeover and them acting as the de facto governing power, that has basically undercut democratic ambitions for people in the Middle East, country to country. And so, as you say, even though there is this broad sympathy as well towards the Palestinian cause, the autocrats are the people that are calling the shots in different countries, or whether it be militia groups. They're not responsive to that, and probably more susceptible, I would say, to money, to buying off, to operating in their own self-interests versus the democratic will of the people.
You know, I share the macro perspective, which is Arab-Israeli peace that excludes Palestinian suffering is silly. It doesn't add up. This attempt at trying to deflect by having peace across the region and ignoring Palestinian suffering and their lack of statehood seems to be a very foolish, short-sighted policy that took on some momentum in the Trump administration. I think that's a mistake. What is also a bigger mistake is the other side of American politics, which up until recently, and you're right, has been de facto kick the can down the road. Palestinian state doesn't seem to be on any administration's primary concern. This, I think, is a huge mistake. And the reason I share that micro assessment is clearly these problematic actors, whether it's Hezbollah or Hamas, whether it's Fatah in the 70s or any group that seeks to hijack this cause. It could be the Syrian regime, Saddam Hussein in 1990, 91, my exact years, I can't remember it right now, sent missiles into Tel Aviv to rally that cause and preserve his regime too. That kind of hijacking of a decent, genuine cause and perverting it over time, I think without a Palestinian state and without serious attempts at ending Israeli occupation and trying to end this nightmare once and for all, short of that, I think unfortunately the Middle East will remain the way it is. It is a primary concern for not just the bad regimes to fade away, but for citizens to have a normal life. And I share that wider lens.
Yes, and lastly, before we let you go, Ronnie, I'll return to kind of where I began, the present day of how many strikes and attacks there have been on southern Lebanon by Israel. What has the mood been in Lebanon? Are people fearful? You talked about how at night Beirut is kind of a bit of a ghost town, but how many people have died, and what this is the situation like on the ground right now?
The total number of deaths, if I'm not mistaken, on the Lebanese side is hovering around 350 to 400. I don't have the exact number. The number of Israeli deaths, I don't know. But in terms of the Lebanese side, whether it's Hezbollah militants or civilians, or even for that matter, journalists doing their job, somebody that I know was killed on October 13. A Reuters photojournalist was doing his job in southern Lebanon and was killed. These people are dying as well. But I think the bigger problem is that this country is so adjusted to abnormality that you can have this happening in the south. You can even have surgical strikes that hit Beirut. I think it's January. The top Hamas leader in the country was killed by an Israeli drone in Beirut, in southern Beirut. You can have that kind of strategic attack too, where a drone missile hits an apartment and hits the people in that apartment, and civilians upstairs and downstairs are spared. This is the kind of abnormality Lebanese grew accustomed to. And you can have a war zone in the south, in the southeast, in the east as well. And you can have also Lebanese going out. Now it's a holiday season. There's many religious holidays in this country that tend to line up sometimes all together. This year it's 2 variations of Easter and Ramadan. So Lebanese go out. There's traffic sometimes. People go out, they drink, they dance, they eat. They spend their night hours outside, knowing full well that there's a war happening, not just in Israel and Gaza, but in southern Lebanon. That's the country I've grown up in. I think that's the biggest tragedy, is that everyone's accustomed to it now, and the prospects for some form of positive stability long term, I don't see them emerging anytime soon.
Well, we can only hope. Ronnie, I really appreciate your time today. The podcast is called the Beirut Banyan. Walk Beirut. You do some walking tours. If anyone's ever in the area, you should hit up Ronnie and his group. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate it. I'd like to just say one thing, though, before we go.
Sure.
I know your platform, thanks to a friend of mine who's been on your show, Drew Mkhayed. He actually briefly introduced me to Michael Brooks. And Michael Brooks, this is a week before his passing. We were sort of interacting with each other online. I grew to find him very attractive, an insatiable laugh, serious politics and principles too, but also nuance, which is rare. So I've grown, I'm a big fan of the show. So thanks to Michael Brooks and your platform for letting me know better about what's happening in the US as well.
Thank you, Ronnie.
Thank you so much. That's great to hear. Really appreciate that, and have a good rest of your day. Or
Thank
night.
you. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. All right, folks. With that, we're going to wrap up the first part of this program. 3 parts, head into the fun half. That was great to hear. Some wonderful words about Michael. Matt, what's happening on Left Reckoning?
Yeah. Let me remind myself. Well, we had Anthony Fantano on to talk about the Kendrick Lamar diss verse that is kind of throwing people into a tizzy. And also Kurt Hackbarth and his co-host of his new show, Soberania, I believe it's called, talking about Mexico and AMLO and that sort of stuff. So check that out. Really good show. Really full show, frankly. We gave you your money's worth for the freebie listeners on Tuesday. So watch that show.
And on ESPN, we spoke about the women's championship, Caitlin Clark's lasting impact, the Stephon Diggs trade, and more. I guess a little bit of my concerns about the Milwaukee Bucks, although they actually had a pretty big win last night against Orlando, so they might have locked up that 2 seed. We'll be talking about the NBA and the NHL playoffs approaching and more on Monday as well. YouTube.com/ESPN show.
Yeah, we've got Brandon here, and I'm going to get Binder here in a second as well.
Hey, Brandon.
Hello.
Hello.
Hey.
What's happening over on the discourse?
Well, this weekend I'm going to be launching a little bit of self-indulgent novelty on the discourse. I've decided to do a few more extended media takes for the fans because I know there's been requests for that. So I'll be releasing one of those and we'll see how it goes, which won't replace our normal political work that is admittedly inconsistent, but
everything's political.
You'll be getting both.
Some Kelly analysis, Brandon?
Oh man, I have a lot of thoughts about the family dynamics and Cadet Kelly. But I don't want to get into this right now, but
all right,
we can be at this for an hour.
Yeah, save it for the listeners of the show. Binder, what's happening on Doomed and Scam Economy and such?
Hello. On the flip side of what Brandon said, WrestleMania discussion did completely replace the politics talk on my show. Not completely.
Something's in the air.
Yeah, it was WrestleMania this past weekend, so we definitely talked about it on the feed with listeners who called in, youtube.com/MattBinder. But this audience is probably more interested in this part. We discussed the Arizona abortion ruling. We discussed the incredible Jesse Waters clip over on the Valuetainment podcast.
We have
with
that too.
PBD.
Yeah.
Did you guys play that already?
No, we have it for the fun half. We have it. We have it.
It's oh my god. So maybe you won't go to youtube.com/MattBinder to check that part out, but the rest you will.
We'll see. Maybe we won't get to it. Who knows?
I want to double dip.
We could, or we could just rant about Israel for an hour, which is super easy. All right, we won't do that, I promise, guys. We actually have some fun clips to get to. The number is 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half.
3 months from now, 6 months from now, 9 months from now. And I don't think it's going to be the same as it looks like in 6 months from now. And I don't know if it's necessarily going to be better 6 months from now than it is 3 months from now. But I think around 18 months out, we're going to look back and go like, wow.
What? What is that going on?
It's nuts.
Wait a second. Hold on for a second.
The Majority Report.
Emma, welcome to the program.
Hey.
Matt.
What is up, everyone? Nomi Key.
You did it.
Let's go, Brandon.
Let's go, Brandon.
Bradley, you want to say hello?
Sorry to disappoint everyone. I'm just a random guy.
It's all the boys today.
Fundamentally false.
No, I'm sorry. Women's
Stop talking for a second and let me finish.
Where is this coming from, dude?
But dude,
You want to smoke this 7A?
Yes.
Hi, me? This me?
yes.
Is this me?
Is it me?
It is you.
Is this me? Hello, is this me?
I think it is you. Who is you? No sound. Every single freaking day. What's on your mind?
Sports. We can discuss free markets and we can discuss capitalism.
I'm gonna go throw up.
Libertarians.
They're so stupid, though.
Common sense says, of course.
gobbledygook.
We fucking nailed him.
So what's 79 plus 21?
Challenge Matt.
I'm positively quivering.
I believe 96, I want to say.
857-210-501. 1 half. 3 8s.
9/11, for instance.
$3,400, $1,900.
6, 5, 4, $3 trillion sold. It's a zero-sum game.
Actually, you're making me think less of it.
But let me say this. Poop.
Call it satire. Sam goes, it's satire.
On top of it all, my favorite part about you is just like every day, all day, like everything you do.
Without a doubt. Hey, buddy, we see you. All right, folks.
It's just the week being weeded out, obviously.
Yeah, sun's out, guns out. I don't know.
But you should know.
People just don't like to entertain ideas anymore.
I have a question. Who cares?
Our chat is enabled, folks.
I love it.
I do love that.
Look, gotta jump. Gotta be quick. I gotta jump.
I'm losing it, bro.
2 o'clock. We're already late, and the guy's being a dick. So screw him. Sent to a gulag?
Outrageous.
Like, what is wrong with you?
Love you. Bye.
Love you. Bye-bye.
One.
We are back. Hello, folks. Hello. All right. Let's quickly read some IMs. Demian says, I know Brandon and Binder would hate to do this, but it would be nice to have at least one Thursday with you all in the same room together just for a change-up energy. Also, maybe get day drunk. Apparently, I want chaos. Well, I'm probably going to get day drunk next Thursday because it's my birthday. So, not in the first hour, but in the fun half. It's my 30th birthday.
Congratulations.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm working on it.
The big 3-0.
But I'm going to take that Wednesday off. What'd you say?
You're going to be spending the big 3-0 with us.
I guess I am. So Bender, if you want to come in, I know you're not really a big drinker, but you
can sit in Sam's chair. It'll look exactly the same.
Yeah.
I think really the solution is just for me to get a green screen, and then no one will know. Which I can definitely do. I can do by next week, honestly.
I mean, I would invite you,
yeah.
but you'd have to get on a plane, and I think that might be a little bit much of an ask.
Yeah, but that being said, happy almost birthday. And I will say, I don't know who said I wasn't drunk right now, because that's quite the assumption to make.
I mean, it would be. You're not? All right, but you seem to protest way too much.
About being drunk or about not being drunk?
About not being drunk.
That's what he's not doing.
Definitely.
Well, I'm certainly confused. So
Same here. All right. Fantastic Moron says Michael Brooks was my gateway to the Majority Report during the Bernie campaign of 2016, which was when we crashed the news center during the DNCC convention, which was always will always live in my memories despite meeting Jimmy Dore. I also met many figures of then left YouTube media community, and Michael was always far and above the most morally consistent of anyone in that space. I really miss him and sincerely believe that if he was still alive, the left as a whole, and particularly the YouTube community, would be in a better place. Well, that's very nice.
I think it's true about the YouTube community. I think, I love Michael as much as anybody. I think maybe people put a little bit too much on his shoulders when they think that he'd be able to have maintained the center over the past 4 years of the left. It's been some of these trends that we've seen and pathologies and left turns or right turns from certain folks, I think were kind of foretold even before 2020.
Yeah.
Biden wouldn't have won if things worked out differently. Right. Yeah. I don't think that's quite it. Right.
Vinny the tongue bath guy said, Sam, I didn't mean to neg you yesterday when I said you looked exhausted. I meant it with love. You do the Lord's work and still show up to work the next day and every day. Please know that your first tongue bath is on me. All right. He's not in today. So I am when he's in, and talk about how you want to give him a tongue bath.
Is this like a super chat? Do you have to read these?
I start. I don't read ahead. I've got too much going on, so I just start going, and
Emma particularly looks for all the flattering Sam Seder tweets or posts or comments or chats or whatever, and then she reads all of those specifically.
I like the chats that are anxious follow-ups to previous messages the sender sent that we have already forgotten.
Right. Moodyappolis says, say what you want about O.J. Simpson, but he demonstrated the reliability of the Ford Bronco like no one before or since. Like no one ever before.
I mean, like, as a young 4 or 5-year-old learning what vehicles for the first time, we had a Bronco at that time for a brief period. It seemed different. Like, wow, this thing
was it the white
really,
one?
No, it was blue. But you could really go down a highway against cops in that thing.
It's reliable. That's what you want.
All right.
It's funny they reissued it recently.
They should do a limited edition.
They came out with new Broncos. Am I crazy? Was that a prank?
I don't remember. I don't know anything about cars.
We're very New Yorkers.
Yeah. Nick from PA said they also cut incentive plans for workers as well, and we don't get paid well. I'm not sure what that was a reference to.
Yeah, they literally do Broncos now.
F. Lefty says, been listening since 2016, just became a member. The show has had a profound impact on my political perspective. When I found the show, I was left-leaning, but falling down the IDW rabbit hole. Sam and Michael's comedy surrounding Dave Rubin pulled me back from the brink. Left is best.
That's why we do it.
It's great to hear.
God, Dave Rubin. You don't see Dave Rubin anymore.
Well, if you watch the
Unless
show,
you're in Tel Aviv.
Yeah.
Well,
right.
okay. Well, he's had me blocked for a while now, so I guess I should just say I don't say.
Yeah. No, he has me blocked. As does Candace Owens. Candace Owens has blocked me, and I'll take that as a badge of honor.
Well, that's funny.
Why did Rubin block you, Brandon?
Back when he was supporting Bolsonaro when he first got elected, he tweeted something about this was when Bolsonaro was burning textbooks for social justice classes in Brazil, and he was like, I don't know much about this Bolsonaro fella, but I don't know why I give him a Texas accent. That's not what Dave Rubin sounds like. Doesn't matter. But this makes me think that he's going to take it to lefties, and so I called him a colossal moron, and he blocked me just for that. Can you believe
he doesn't
it?
like being called stupid for some reason.
Real, I mean, come on. He has to hear it all the time.
Also, just a conceptual explainer. People don't know what the IDW is in the chat, and I think that's a good sign.
Mm-hmm.
But just to catch people up, the IDW, as coined, I believe, by Brett or Eric Weinstein, they're interchangeable. And profiled by Barry Weiss, who's also a member, in the New York Times, IDW was the intellectual dark web, which included basically entirely a lot of people that had contrarian thoughts along the lines of is wokeness bad? They all thought yes.
Yes.
Is Israel good? They all thought yes. But they presented themselves as heterodox thinkers that had questions about certain things. I think COVID actually kind of split them up because you had Sam Harris and different sorts of people split, and then the Brett Weinstein go. Actually, the funny way to characterize the split is Brett and Eric Weinstein. Eric Weinstein believed in the vaccine because he thought Israel wouldn't poison their own citizens with something dangerous. And Brett was his brother, thought that actually, no, they made a huge mistake, and they went along with sort of a conspiracy that's going to get everybody killed. So.
This is a perfect transition into our Sam Harris conversation, speaking of the IDW.
Oh, good.
So it's good to hear, as Matt said, that people in our chat don't know what the intellectual dark web was. You can look up that Barry Weiss piece where they all did. There was a photo shoot associated with the two, where they were in some dark forest.
It looked
they were hiding in the bushes.
Right.
No, I think at the time everyone was this was a promotional photo shoot for a Norwegian detective thriller.
I mean,
Cold.
I'll just say Michael Shermer, one of the guys photographed sneaking out of the bushes. There might be, if you look up the history of Michael Shermer, there might be some other reasons he's sneaking out of bushes than of his ideas. I'll just leave it there. But we can move on.
Yeah. I always found it funny that they thought they looked badass in that, where it just looks like kind of, adult Harry Potter fans doing the Forbidden Forest kind of cosplay.
A unicorn.
Yes. Oh, look over there, a centaur. And here's also why
I got a unicorn
Arabs are
tail
genetically
hair for my
inferior.
wand.
Yeah. Sam Harris is one of those guys that was apparently this high-minded intellectual that's definitely not a conservative. It's something different. The intellectual dark web. Just kidding. The reality of Sam Harris is that he was one of these new atheists who Bill Maher would have on all the time, who spoke about how religion was very dangerous and
particularly Islam.
In the end, you look at the analysis, and much of it was about how really it's these Muslim savages in the Middle East that are the threat to polite Western society, and not other religions, just the ones that we can associate with the war on terror, basically. And it doesn't need to be an analysis about U.S. colonialism or Western interference in the region and exploitation and oil and war. It can just be about the inherent debauchery, the inherent evil of of Islam and of the Muslim faith. And so he's been kind of a Trump critic recently. Speaking of that IDW split, he's been criticizing Trump getting some cachet back with liberals. But this was from his podcast episode recently, a reminder that Sam Harris, despite not liking Trump, is still one of the most hateful Islamophobic bigots in media right now.
The overwhelming majority of people who are this confused about how to live good lives are Islamic extremists, and the worst of these are jihadists. Now, Hamas is a jihadist organization. In my view, that's all we need to know about it. The question of how it got that way is fundamentally uninteresting.
Pause it.
As is the question of why so many Palestinians have come to support it.
This is why. Okay, I just want to take this piecemeal. Why is it uninteresting to you to talk about the origins of Hamas, Sam Harris? Because it would undercut everything you're saying?
Yeah, because the context actually tells you everything you need to know. Why does the colonial resistance group form? Why does it resort to terrorism? Like, these things are all actually have been studied even beyond the Israel-Palestine experience.
It's just also just a very anti-materialist take, obviously. And it's the kind of thing that I think appeals to, like, you know, very middle-brow thinkers who presume themselves to be very intelligent, that they would think, of course, because Islam is something different. It's something that exists outside of, like, traditional historical and material, you know, cause and effect. It's something that just, like, makes your brain rot out. But, like, that's completely ridiculous, obviously. And he would not accept that kind of, you know, and I think go back to your earlier point about, like, the distinctions that they make between Islam and other, even Abrahamic religions. Like, they would never cast Christians who probably exist in their communities with that same light. They wouldn't say, like, it doesn't matter.
Right, and they've done this before, by the way. It's kind of an evolution from just traditional racism, where you saw it honestly in the way that Black people were talked about in this country, where it's like, well, I mean, where are the fathers? What's wrong with the values that they're teaching? And it's just kind of a way to be like, Black people are inferior. Now it's not just Muslim people they're not civilized inherently. It's what's being taught to them in their ideology.
Well, I mean, that's a great point, Emma, because when we saw racism as defined by, or at least, like, vocal racism defined by, like, just the argument that Black people are inherently naturally inferior, become unpopular, we saw so much more, you know, so many more, like, right-wing thinkers, like, shift to that, you know, it's Black culture. It's not natural. Mm-hmm. It's Black culture. And it's something that Black culture, you're not even supposed to examine it in the context of, like, well, what gave rise to Black culture? Is it, like, white supremacist American culture? Is that a big sort of bedrock of, like, Black culture in America? You know, maybe not, but that shouldn't be taken into account when you're talking about, like, why Black people believe the things that they believe, you know, why they participate in society. And, you know, that's just now being adapted to, like, Islam as a general term for, like, I guess, Arab culture. Basically. Because they definitely mean Arab people. They don't mean, like, when they think of Muslims, they don't think of, like, all of the Asian Muslims in parts of the Indonesia, but they think of, you know, like, Arab people.
Exactly. All right.
That's all we need to know about it. The question of how it got that way is fundamentally uninteresting.
I'm sure.
As is the question of why so many Palestinians have come to support it. It would be like asking in 1941 how the SS became so radicalized. And why do so many millions of Germans support it? That's an interesting question now.
Yeah, pause it.
Right now that Nazism has been...
Why would you not want to examine that?
Right.
Why would you not want to examine that? That is an interesting question. It's actually really important.
It's also important to like start like trying to figure that stuff out as it's happening. You know, history isn't just something that we do in hindsight to talk about the past. Like understanding the contemporary socio-political and other factors that led to the rise of Nazism as it's happening concurrently is important, because a lot of times once it's over, there's a lot of revisionist history that is painted for a lot of these things. Like a lot of Nazism gets blamed entirely on like lower class Germans, for example, when we know, especially from writings at the time, that there was a lot of support amongst the more upwardly mobile middle class Germans of the time. It wasn't simply just like it wasn't like totally lower class rebellion, take over the country. The petite bourgeoisie were very involved in it.
Yeah, I mean, and abstracting the Holocaust from history is extremely dangerous. We've been saying this as it relates to this 6 months of Israel's genocide for a while now, because Netanyahu has spread conspiracy theories that it was actually the Palestinian Grand Mufti who gave Hitler the idea to exterminate the Jews. And then you hear Sam Harris saying this exact kind of same thing. We'll keep playing it, but saying that Hamas and jihadists generally are worse than the Nazis. I mean, I think that is basically a denial of the conditions that led to the Holocaust, because you should be examining that this was a fascist, far-right, nationalistic political movement that occurred within historical and political context and didn't just come out of, like, say, some random ideology. These are all powerful and power structures that led to the rise of Nazis, and they're not too far away from the ones that still exist today. I mean, not saying that is exactly that's going to happen, but the point is just like it's less than 100 years old, and it's not like we fundamentally remade society in a way that we don't have these kind of far-right demagogues anymore. Nazism and far-right movements exist throughout the world, but abstracting them from history means you don't have to analyze the power structures that led to it. And you can make these crazy claims like Sam Harris does here.
Support it? That's an interesting question now, right now that Nazism has been defeated. But in 1941, there was nothing to do but kill Nazis. I feel exactly the same way about jihadists. In fact, jihadists are worse than Nazis, in my view. They don't have the same power the Nazis had in the 30s and 40s, which is a very good thing, and we should keep it that way. But their ideology is actually worse.
All right, pause it again.
Jihadists.
I'm sorry.
Wow. That's something else. I mean, just to your point before we listen to more of that, Emma, that's one of the main purposes of like extricating the Holocaust and World War II and the atrocities committed by the Germans during that time from history, from modernity, from like any contemporary analysis, because then you don't have to examine all of the component characteristics that existed in their society and existed globally that gave rise to it, that could continue to exist to this day. You can just pretend like it was an anomaly. It wasn't an atrocity committed by the Western world. And that's why you can say things like, oh, Islamic jihadists are actually worse than the Nazis because their culture is giving rise to this hatred. But that's not what happened with the Nazis in Germany. It was something different. It wasn't Western culture giving rise to this sort of thing. It wasn't the anti-Semitism and the colonialism and the sort of just widespread fascism that existed at the time in one form or another. It was just an anomaly, which is different than Islamicism or whatever, which is just like it's like that's all their culture is. That's all their culture can give rise to. It's very insidious.
It's really insidious, and what you do is lay conditions for history to repeat itself when you aren't explicit about this, and when you say that the fact that Nazis that had more power is irrelevant to our condemnation of them as a political movement. I mean, the whole problem with the Nazis is that they had power. It's not this isn't some sort of you're a bad guy, I'm a good guy, I'm a civilized smart person, you're a dumb brown person analysis. I mean, this is just for children.
Well, it's purely ideological.
Yeah.
We've moved from any sort of material or historical considerations into who has the worst brain and whose brain is doing the worst thing. And that is a fundamentally misanthropic and elitist position. And that's what Sam Harris is here for.
And in the end, it's racist too. I mean, because why would you be absolving? Yeah.
No, it's also fucked up to be like, sorry, cursing, but it's also messed up to say like, oh, the Nazis are gone. That's why we can analyze them critically now. And also the Nazis aren't that bad. You know who's really bad? Brown people. Yep. Like that's his analysis. At the same time, he's saying Nazis don't exist. He's also saying they're not so bad, not as bad as like degenerate Muslims. Like, yeah, it's wild.
It's analogous to what Douglas Murray said after he watched the tape from October 7th, like the unedited footage from October 7th. That basically he wrote an op-ed afterwards where he was like, even Nazis like drank themselves to sleep to like forget all of the atrocities that they committed. They were racked with guilt about what they were doing in the concentration camps. Somehow, in the effort to say how bad Hamas is and how evil Hamas is, it's also somehow in some way implicitly obviating or at least slightly absolving what the Nazis did in the Holocaust.
Yeah.
I mean, the jump to just bringing up the Nazis too is a tell there. Like, why even bring them up? Why?
Yeah.
I'll also just make a note, like, don't fucking give Richard Hanania any attention. Don't quote tweet him. Leave that little Nazi roach, like, to die in obscurity. People need to not be shocked by the Nazi doing Nazi things on Twitter and quote tweeting it. But anyway, here we go.
But their ideology is actually worse. Jihadism is essentially Nazism plus an expectation of paradise. It's
Pure
Nazism plus religious fanaticism. Nazism plus an eagerness to be martyred and to see their children martyred. There are many differences between Nazism and jihadism, of course, but they only make the Nazis look comparatively benign.
Oh my God.
Nazism was a quasi-religious phenomenon.
Nazi apologism.
Right? These people were not rationalists. It was basically racist mysticism anchored to a cult of personality. But the Nazis didn't use their own women and children as human shields.
This is him. So that's just basically saying that the jihadists want you to kill their children.
Yeah.
And also that the Nazis weren't so bad, apparently. That's what I learned today from Sam Harris's podcast. Didn't he used to just do like Zen meditation or something? I feel like
him and Russell Brand.
Oh.
They meditated their way towards minimizing the Nazis compared to Hamas. There's a couple things I want to play here. One is this Indian diplomat here talking with, I forget this guy, Karan Thapar, who does really great interviews. And this is just him talking. This is how diplomats talk about. This is not like far leftists. This is not, some sort of like extremist group. This is ambassadors. This is how ambassadors talk about terrorism, who aren't like cowed by Israel.
Now, yesterday, Mr. Emmer, Israel announced what it called an extraordinary listing of Lashkar-e-Taiba as a terrorist organization. India has so far not listed Hamas as a terrorist organization, but the Israeli ambassador has made clear to Indian journalists that Israel has formally asked India to do this. If India does take that step, perhaps in response to what Israel has taken yesterday, how will it be viewed in Riyadh, in Cairo, in Abu Dhabi, in Amman?
India has suffered terrorist violence from Lashkar-e-Taiba from 1989 to 1990. That is for nearly 35 years. I never heard the Israelis say anything in that regard over all these decades. And now suddenly, opportunistically, because they want India to take a tough public posture and declare Hamas as a terrorist organization, they have done this with regard to Lashkar-e-Taiba. I think both actions, this Israeli action, declaring Lashkar-e-Taiba as a terrorist organization and our declaring Hamas as a terrorist organization are really meaningless. They serve no useful purpose. We are not involved. We are not engaged. As far as Hamas is concerned, we have had no engagement with them as an organization. We have never taken a public position, and therefore we've never described it. To call Hamas at this moment a terrorist organization, to my mind, would be a travesty. Hamas is a political entity, and it has participated in elections. The reason why you find the Palestine Authority so feeble today is because the Palestine Authority itself, led by Mahmoud Abbas, Israel, and the United States, are terrified that if you had free and fair elections in the West Bank and Gaza, the Hamas would win. It would win hands down. That is why we have not had elections from 2011 till today. And you have Mahmoud Abbas in position, elected for 5 years, now in place for the last 15 or 20 years. Therefore, it is also a militant organization, it has a militant part. It is a resistance movement. It is a resistance movement in line with numerous resistance movements that you have found in occupied territories, indeed in our own country as well. We have therefore, as I have said, and I'm going to repeat my cliche, that terrorism, like beauty, lies in the eyes of the beholder. And therefore, academia has moved away. We don't use the word terrorism, we use the word violent extremism. And that is a neutral term. Terrorism is a term used by governments that are attacked by resistance fighters, and very often we stigmatize them as terrorists. That is neither here. As far as India is concerned, labeling Hamas as a terrorist.
That's it.
That's it.
Sorry, that was a little bit fast.
That was that's half the speed that Matt normally listens to this stuff anyway.
But the point is just obvious to anyone who isn't getting all of their news from basically media organizations that haven't wrestle with the fact that Zionism and Zionists and Israel lie about this stuff all the time and use these sort of terms like terrorist as propaganda. If we have time, I also have another clip of Sam Harris. This is recently, maybe, I don't know if you can see the date there, but probably within the last month or so, on the Decoding the Gurus podcast. And here it is, if you're at like 55, Bradley, and they talk about, this is a great podcast, very, I think, fair, not leftist, but they put this to Sam Harris, like, how are you talking about the religious fundamentalism on one side and ignoring it on the other? And I think Sam Harris's response is interesting.
In the Israeli government, who had a poster on the wall of a terrorist and
want Netanyahu kind of supporting the increasing settlement movement and courting the far right, the religious right. So my kind of point there is, if you present that conflict as being, purely about the forces of civilization versus like a religious fanatical cult, and don't mention that there is a fanatical religious cult that is in the government of Israel and has made various statements which are similarly talking about the promised land and reclaiming it, that it seems like you're being selective. And it doesn't mean that you have to say they're both equal in that respect. You can still completely condemn Hamas and all the things. You can still argue that Israel has a right to defend itself, but it doesn't require serving as their kind of propaganda wing, because lots of Israelis were very unhappy with Netanyahu and his government. It is a very right-wing government. And the last thing I'll say, and I'll give you a chance to respond, Sam, is like the ex-Israeli prime minister who was assassinated, Rabin, he wasn't assassinated by Islamic extremists. Yeah. He was assassinated by a Jewish extremist who derailed the peace negotiations that were going on, and the legacy of which was that Netanyahu, who was in opposition to Rabin, ended up in power. So the history over there is very complex in that, but I'm arguing, isn't there a case that the presentation yourself and Douglas Murray have done kind of whitewashes those concerns, which are legitimate?
No. I mean, I raise those points a fair amount. It's just in proportion to the problem on the Islamic side. Yeah. They're quite small. I mean, they're very unhelpful. I would fully grant to you that Netanyahu has been a disaster. His support for the settlements has been provocative. He's to some degree culpable for what happened on October 7th, if for no other reason that his attention was split, and he was propping up the settlements in the West Bank and leaving the border with Gaza, fairly undefended, right? So, but yeah, all the mad work that the settlers are doing in the West Bank, and the religious extremists who support them, all of that is incredibly unhelpful, and I don't support it at all. And I've said in other contexts, I thought that the settlers should be dragged off contested land by their beards, right? I mean, that's not optically a great thing to say in the aftermath of October 7th, but I'm Jewish and I can say whatever I want on the topic. I think those people are religious imbeciles, and they're creating immense harm, right? And they're imagined claims upon.
Why doesn't the state of Israel act like it? Why does it instead act like actually they're part of the plan here? That's a simple question. But Sam Harris, history only matters when it's time to bomb Gaza for October 7th. Now you get out of. We don't need to talk about the ideology of the Israelis or in the settlers. We don't need to, that stuff's irrelevant. Because that stuff's only actually relevant to these people when they want to demonize somebody that's getting bombed.
All right, well, that was fun to see him a little bit uncomfortable there.
But that is the solution to the West Bank. I'm sorry, not dragged off by the beards, but there has to be some sort of expulsion that's probably not going to be, and I'm not saying by just violence, but the international community needs to say, you need to go.
Yeah.
These houses belong to the right of return. All that stuff. There's going to be violent resistance if that ever came to pass by Israelis, and there needs to be defense against actually doing what's right, which is to end the occupation, full right of return. These actually are things that need to be confronted, and we've left it till this. Instead of confronting actually this stuff, we've left it until the violence continues to spurt out, because there's actually no military or fencing solution. Even if Netanyahu had the fence of Gaza being guarded and wasn't supporting the settlers, that's not really a solution.
Also, he's totally talking out of both sides of his mouth there by going, he literally says back to back, the religious extremists in Israel are very small. It's not that big of a problem. But October 7th happened because Netanyahu was distracted by what was going on with the religious.
Right.
I mean, what?
Yep. All right, guys, let's take a really quick call here. Calling from an 864 area code. 864. Who's this? Where are you calling from? 864? 864. All right, going once, going twice. Bye-bye. Calling from a 971 area code. Who's this? Where you calling from?
Hello?
Hello.
Hi.
Whoa,
yeah,
bro.
I wanted...
Dude, your phone is super
Your call's
hot.
really hot. We're going to try
on
to take you down,
speakers?
but just, less air into the phone line if you can.
Can you hear me?
That's better,
That's
yeah.
better, yeah.
What's your name? Where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Oregon. I'm Matthew, and I wanted to get your thoughts on Ben Shapiro and a thought I had long, long ago that is now actually coming. Well, I kind of predicted it.
There's something up with your phone.
Hello?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, you can keep it real quick here if you can.
Hello, is that better?
Yeah, sure. We'll try it if you can just make it real succinct.
Yeah, so everybody is acting like Ben Shapiro's not being a free speech warrior is surprising, mainly people on the right. And I actually saw long, long ago, around 2016, when I actually was paying close attention to him, and he was going to these college campuses saying all this stuff, and you say, oh, Ben Shapiro defeats or embarrasses college kids, and he was being propped up as this like hero of free speech. But then if you paid attention to his bias on Israel, I thought to myself, well, something's going to happen to where his hypocrisy on free speech will be exposed. And my only question to you guys is, did you see that? Did you see this hypocrisy coming long ago as I did?
Yes, but unfortunately, your phone is killing everybody's ears right now. I'm so sorry, dude. You have a good point. You have a good point, and I gotta hang up. Try again, maybe on a different phone line, okay?
But this is what we always
thanks so
said
much.
about the IDW in general, which is like none of these people criticize Israel. None of these people have anything to say about BDS. It's all simulated. So yeah, no, this is completely unexpected, and I'm not surprised that the split happened along this line, frankly. And I think it's going in a really ugly way that maybe we should get a guest on with the Nick Fuentes sort of crowd. Not really a great sign. And it'd be nice if we could get like Congress to maybe stop looking at people who want the genocide of Palestinians to stop and say like that's where the anti-Semitism is, and more along the lines of like, oh yeah, all these people saying Christ is king because of Ben Shapiro's position on, admittedly a pro-genocide position on Israel.
That's what Tucker's doing these days. He's
Exactly.
saying he's trying to make like our support for Israel an anti-Christian bias because of the Palestinian Christians, which is just not the point that needs to be made, obviously.
Yeah.
But
not the sign that I want to see that Israel is losing the PR offensive, frankly.
Right. Calling from an 847 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
Hey, MR crew, can you hear me okay?
Can hear you great. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
Yeah, this is Brian from the Chicago suburbs.
Brian from the Chicago
Hey,
suburbs.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up by saying thank you for having the that person on to talk about the housing crisis and how like the property management stuff is all automated these days. I had called. I was the one that was talking about how I'd been sent to eviction court 3 times by my landlord because they were super inflexible and everything. Update on that is I'm in a new place now. Things are looking up. We're good. I'm going to owe those people a lot of money, but that's their problem. But yeah, so I'm, that was one of the things I ran into a lot where they were just like, oh, well, we just can't really do anything for you because, unfortunately it's like all automated and it just automatically applies it. And so everything was just a battle to try to get any kind of fairness out of them. But
Caller,
I just wanted to say thank you for
Caller,
putting
do you
that
know?
through. And
Sorry to interrupt, Caller. Do you know how many like units that is it like your unit? Is it like your building? How many units is your landlord managing?
so they have like I don't know how many the parent company does altogether. Like I said, they were Red Tail Realty. But in the complex that I was in, they had like a pretty big stretch of land. It was like there was like at least like a half-mile long street that they had buildings on both sides of that whole area. So, I mean, it was definitely probably a couple hundred units at least.
See, I mean, that's insane. Like, because that at that scale, what you can do is basically hire enforcers, and that's their entire job is to evict people and stuff like that. Whereas, like, I'll be honest, I'm in a pretty decent situation where my rent hasn't been drastically. I'm the only tenant of people, and obviously people can be abused by landlords who they're the only tenant for them too, but. The people that I rent from don't have the ability to have like just part of their operation is to kick me out if, let's say, I don't want to pay a rent increase or something like that. And so like we just cannot allow these companies to achieve be at any kind of scale. This stuff has to be massive. These giant property holding things need to be looked at as piñatas that need to be smashed by policy and, the candy given out to everybody.
Yeah, and one last thing I'll wrap up with before I jump. And especially with the eviction court process that they had, I mean, you would have their one lawyer handling, every time I was in there, I mean, the same lawyer would be handling probably at least 15 cases probably. And so, I mean, they would just sit there and just roll through, and it was just a rubber stamp process where it was like, okay, do you want them out or what do you want to do? And I mean, there was barely any wiggle room. I mean, they kind of, being in Illinois, I mean, is probably better in some places, but I mean, realistically, there was no like, hey, what's your side of the story? What happened? Can we do any, they would say, oh yeah, you can, there's this legal representation that you can get, you have to apply for to see if you can, be eligible for it. Otherwise, I mean, they said something about mediation, but the landlord can decide if they want to participate in mediation, if I'm not mistaken. So, I mean, realistically, I mean, you're still, the landlord's calling the shots, and if they don't want to play ball, they don't have to. And, like I said, they wouldn't even take partial payments or anything like that, all the while citing the Fair Housing Act. And it's just crazy to me,
Yeah.
They're saying that, we got to treat everybody the same. So that must mean we got to treat them like assholes. So,
Right.
But thank you for your coverage. We really appreciate it. You guys have a good one. Okay.
Thanks so much. You too, Brian. Brian from Kentucky. I'd like to see Sam Harris explain how rational and not extremist the Third Temple is in Israel among Jewish extremists. Excavating under Al-Aqsa Mosque so it will collapse. Netanyahu literally held a press conference under the mosque as a way of bragging about destroying it. I did not even know that.
Sam Harris's legit position is that stuff is less important because Palestinians do suicide bombing sometimes.
And now they're going to sacrifice 4 red heifers. Is it heifers?
Heifers,
yeah. Without any white hair.
Not a country girl, Emma.
Yeah. Well, I thought I'd heard heifers in relation to like women.
Right, of course.
But I didn't know if I should say it. So I was like, which way could I go? All right. Anyway, definitely not a country girl. June from El Paso says, shout out to Matt's piñata analogy. Shit was fire.
That's one of my favorites, frankly. A lot of piñatas out there.
Mike in Philly said, did Sam Harris just call Nazism rational?
I think you call it pseudo-rational, but more rational than Hamas, I think.
I think he was saying it's pseudo-religious, but that it wasn't
pseudo-religious.
Quasi.
Which, I mean, half of the things that he was saying about like Nazism and Nazi Germany, I was like, clearly he doesn't know anything about Nazism and Nazi Germany, because pseudo-religious is putting it mildly. But again, like he's just like, this is just racism, Arabs are how he's coding Islam.
He said what one of the things he said? Oh, he said something like, it stuck out to me. It was that jihadists are trying to create a paradise for themselves, and it's like, wait, but like it's literally why the Nazis were expelling people from the country. Like, yeah.
And I mean, what is Israel doing? They're literally saying we have a right to this land because like
The Bible.
the Bible and our genes from 2,000 years ago, and I want to create this ethnic state paradise. It's all
literally taking
what
land
about-
and houses from
What
people.
about Christian evangelicals who are supporting Israel's right to do a genocide because they think that Jewish people need to be in Israel for Jesus Christ to literally come back to
Right.
earth to like then kill all of them, like I don't know, like at the Ark of the Covenant style. Like, I mean, come on. I think if anything, the people who are most engaged with their material circumstances are the Palestinians in this circumstance. The rest of them, Israel as well, but evangelicals are just going off pure just religious zealotry.
Speaking of those evangelicals, Donald Trump has, I guess, now been speaking out a little bit more about Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza, but mostly in the sense of like, I would have done it better. I'm not going to specify how. And after October
It would be
7th,
over by now.
it would have been over by now. Like the idea that he wouldn't have said, bring fire and fury upon them after October 7th if he were president right now. Of course he would have. And that would have been exactly what led to the same result here. The difference is just that like Biden is a Zionist and ideologically you read everything. I mean, he's emotional about Israel, like passionate about it. And he's an older man and seemingly that's not moving. That's not shaken. The only thing that's working is pressure. The difference is that Trump is a maniac and also has a constituency of Christian evangelicals who literally believe that when the Jews go back to Israel, that the rapture or whatever is going to happen and a majority of Jews will go to hell and burn in hellfire and some of the good ones will remain and then Jesus will come back. And that's like one of the more under-discussed political realities of U.S. support for Israel is this right-wing Christian evangelical base that backs the project wholeheartedly because of their, visions of religious utopia, basically. So this is Trump now speaking on the tarmac about Jewish Americans. And he's repeating what he says often about how Jewish people that vote Democrat are actually bad Jews, because he can determine that, apparently.
Again, they brought down the rate so fast because they want to get elected, and it's going to work out just.
Have you called Netanyahu? Have you spoken to Prime Minister Netanyahu? Obviously, the White House is issuing a stark warning. Do you think that the U.S. is not doing enough to show support for Israel, or are you going to go?
Biden has totally lost control of the Israel situation. He has abandoned Israel. He's totally abandoned Israel, and frankly, he's a low IQ individual. He has no idea where he is and who he's supporting. He doesn't know if he's supporting the Palestinians, but he knows one thing. He is not supporting Israel. He has abandoned Israel. And any Jewish person that votes for a Democrat or votes for Biden should have their head examined.
Okay,
What can you say?
Was it like cheering at the end? Like he was the Beatles walking off at like JFK or whatever?
Yeah. Can we get an encore? Can you say some great replacement theory stuff to finish the anti-Semitism theme?
Imagine if Ilhan Omar said Jews that vote for Republicans should have their head examined.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we couldn't hear. Bradley said she'd get arrested off mic anyway. But yeah, it's what can you even say? I mean, he's so dumb, and I think it's interesting to kind of see how the making Israel Palestine into one of like a religious war is really all reactionaries and right wingers can fall back on. They can't analyze the power and elements. They can't analyze the settler colonialism elements. They make it into like Jews versus Arabs, Christians versus Jews, and it's
the 1,000-year battle.
Yeah, and it's obviously not. It's Biden is older than the state of Israel, so this is not.
Well, to be fair, he's 1,000 years old.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of those people have like Christian nationalist views for their own country as well. And so I'm sure, a lot of that is aspirational, in the sense that, you know, a lot of those people, those evangelicals specifically, those people who want to frame it as their religious war, at least on the right, would like to pretend like America is some sort of eons old country that was a Christian nation put on a hill by God, and we're like living in the promised land too. So it's not surprising, or also one where they could oppress and possibly genocide their religious opponents. So it's not surprising, I think, that they succumb to that framing, because they agree with all the settler colonial like stuff. The part that they're
why Nazis or anti-Semites and really far-right people like Israel, and they don't like it in the sense, they'll still say horrible things about Jewish people, but they love the idea of a religious or ethnic, based nationalistic project. They like the idea that of a nation being defined by a religion or whiteness or ethnicity, what have you. So, didn't mean to cut you off, Brandon.
Oh no, I mean, I just think a lot of this divide on the far right, as you were hinting towards, is just manufactured. Generally, they're racist. Generally, they're all in favor of these sort of ethno states. A lot of this division is because it's now more profitable, even amongst right wingers, to take an anti-Israel stance, partially because of the rampant anti-Semitism that's been fomenting on the right, so, you know, forever, but especially since Trump and, you know, online groper Nazis became way more popular. But generally, I don't think it's an actual principled stance, not even a principled stance to protect Christians, because, you know, a lot of that stuff is just, especially from people like Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson, is just not real. It's like completely fabricated. It's you know, convenient. It's like the thing with the IDW. Eventually, they get tired of, I think, communing with each other, and they just manufacture a schism because it creates drama. It's just like wrestling. You know, it's every so often a tag team breaks up, and they have to start like competing for the Intercontinental Championship or something. And it's like, oh my gosh.
Right. And it's like,
there's always the one guy who makes it big and the other one fades into obscurity. And that's what we usually see with these guys too.
Look at Diamond and Silk, fresh and fit.
All right, that's it.
Those are the only two. Those are the only two I could think of. I don't think there are any other partnerships.
Yeah, it's kind of anathema to, you know, right? It would look weak if another right-wing personality were to have a partner. I mean, come on, it's got to be the force of your own commentary.
I mean, it's funny because like the Israel thing, I mean, in part it's because of this anti-Semitism that like Brandon talks about, but also like what's going on is just indefensible. And that whole part of the right-wing media sphere, of course they exist to defend the indefensible all the time, but usually you can pivot to Aaron Rodgers or someone being censored for something, like, right, to have to deal with it every day, day in and day out. It's like, it's too much of a hit to a brand. Mm-hmm. And fundamentally that is, I think, more important to most people than Zionism.
Let's take a call really quickly. Calling from an 818 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
It's Dave from Jamaica. Hey crew, how you guys doing?
Dave, so good to hear from you. How you doing?
I'm not bad. So right into the topic. I wanted to talk about crime because I know a few weeks back, you know, people are trotting out the old 90s arguments.
Oh, yeah.
How to deal with crime and you know, very frustrating from certain folks. But the thing I want to say is, though, I tend to, since I've dealt with these type of arguments for a long time, especially in Jamaica, which we had, we still have crime issues, but less so now because there's more economic development. So I wonder why. But so the issue I have is I think sometimes in this debate we need to be a little more, I don't know what the right word is, but tougher with people in the sense that a lot of people kind of repeat certain narratives about crime and so on and so forth. And challenging them tends to cause them to think about it, even though they might be upset in the moment, right? Because when you have to think about the position you're defending, you know, that kind of can crack open an avenue to change one's mind. Or am I alone in that type of thinking?
You're not alone, Dave, but
too much harm.
I don't know if you're at work. Your phone's a little bit cutting out.
Oh, yeah, definitely at work, so I'm going to make it quick.
Okay.
So the last thing I want to add to that is, how do you think we should? How do you guys think the best way to approach it? Because, like, you know, sometimes reading out stats, people don't tend to listen. But, you know, I think it is I think it's these things are kind of self-evident, you know, like, you know, if you have a job, you're less likely to commit crime. And people, you know, shoplifting are not making bank. I know that was a ridiculous statement in this.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people don't really understand how crime actually works. You know, there's no statistical number of people who are kleptomaniacs. So I do find it frustrating because, you know, I hear the same stuff and I have it out with people, and granted they're upset in the moment, but they kind of have to come to terms with reality. And, you know, it's not just bad people, good people. You know, a materialist analysis. Anyway,
right.
Since I'm at work, I don't want Echo to kill you guys. So later.
All right, cool.
I hear what you're saying,
respond.
David.
Yeah.
Yeah, basically, you know, the problem is like people. This isn't like a conversation about like an abstract policy or something. Like this is something that people actually experience in their everyday lives directly. Not like, oh, this policy does that and that affects this. This is a direct effect on people. Like if you're walking down the street and, you know, something happens to you, you get attacked, you get mugged, whatever, you directly experience that. So if someone's telling you that, city's been, whatever city has been safer than ever, you're dealing with people who are like, well, I just had this happen to me. So how can you say that? Because that's basically how people experience these things. Or how they view it through that lens. Like, you know, when we say the city's safe, that doesn't mean there is no crime. That just means statistically, it's you're less likely for something to it's less likely for something to happen to you.
It was worse.
Unfortunately, for those people who it does happen to, that they are that small percentage in that statistic. But, you know, it's hard to convince them that because, you know, they directly experienced it. Mm-hmm. But, you know, it's hard to like say, like you said, like people don't listen to like stats and stuff, but this is something where like that is super important. Like no one considers this until a crime happens to them. Like no one walks through their everyday where crime doesn't happen to them and say, oh, everything's so safe, crime isn't happening to me. They ever only think about this when it does. Like the absence of crime is not something people think of. That's the default.
But it's sort. You're right, Bender. But it's also people like get titillated by it. To be honest with you, that haven't experienced it before. So like it's driven a lot by, specifically in New York, people that live in suburbia that are obsessed with property values, that come into that read the New York Post, and women that listen to true crime or something like that. And they're almost just like, wow, you know, God, it's so scary, all these black and brown people in New York, and they'll read the New York Post, or if people just keep their TV on, every local news story is about some sort of crime, which completely misrepresents the trends, you know? So I think it's also like the prospect of it having to people, there's this, you know, I don't know. It's hard for me. It's almost titillating is the only word I can think of, honestly.
No, absolutely, because that's how you have to cover it. Like, you know, the local news isn't going to be like, let's say New York, 8 million people, 7.9999 million people did not have crime happen to them today. They don't do that. They go, oh, here are the 10 people that, these are the 10 news stories where 10 different people had something happen to them today, and they rinse, wash, repeat, and people see that and they go, oh, it must be scary out there or something. When like it's just, you know, that's just ridiculous to think about it that way. Like people's perception on this is completely like out of whack. The fact that you're able to go to work, walk down the street, go to a restaurant, go pick up your kids from school, whatever, and something not happen to you 9.9 times out of 10 is the fact that things are safe. Like their crime is down.
It's also, I mean, I'm sorry, were you going to jump in, Matt?
No, I was just going to say real quick, prison populations, like you have to look at this stuff systemically. And the thing is, like, even the individual lens of like this person says that points to like society needing to control people more is just not going to satisfy even victims of crime. Ultimately, you need to look at how these things, like what leads to rising levels of desperation, that sort of thing. But also, you can't look at something like prison without looking at the fact that that means federal money for the to imprison people. That's an industry, and also that means that counts to the census that the county that prison population is in. So you take people out of certain communities and put them into like less urban ones and count that towards like this is all systemic stuff. You just have to look at it that way.
Yeah, I mean, just to, echo what Matt and Emma was saying, I think at local television level, you just see murder, like kill, which I know probably sounds like a good song, but it's not. It's just this, it's just the 8 o'clock news in New York City. At the, more national news level, you might see statistics like Dave was hinting at about like falling crime, overarching, like longitudinal studies about stuff. But I feel like even on national news, you don't really see that contextualized. You might see that crime has fallen since the 80s or since the 90s or since, some arbitrary date and time. And they might gesture to like changing social economic conditions in the country. But very rarely are they going to have someone who is just a criminologist or a sociologist come on and explain specifically what has caused the crime rate to fall, because generally speaking, America has a very conservative view on crime, and that crime is caused by intellectual and moral failings of criminals and not the material conditions that we subject large portions of this country to, which make them desperate, which give rise to criminality in various parts of traditionally deprived communities. And so, bringing people on to explain how crime actually works might be more compelling, but it doesn't fit that sort of larger narrative that crime is an individual moral intellectual failure. So it's difficult to get people into thinking in that sort of more progressive frame of mind. Like Matt was saying, that crime is a structural and social failure, and it can only be dealt with that way because we just have a very individualistic society, and people are, oftentimes only hearing about like crime and what causes crime and criminals on the news from like cops. You'll have like a ex-cop or like an ex-DA come on to talk about like what he thinks is causing crime. And also to your point, Emma, like a lot of people's definition of crime is still like broken windows policing. And so they see graffiti, or they see a homeless person on the street, or they see any other like long list of like urban trends like garbage, and they immediately associate that with danger. And that was a concerted effort by the police and by police associated organizations to make it easier to over police communities.
Yeah, Eric Adams like literally admitted that in the interview with Olayemi. He's like, yeah, sometimes people are concerned about it. It's like, bro, that's your job, is to help people not see the homeless problem as crime and actually something you need to address.
I think that specifically the issue of homelessness, I think that is a huge driver of this fear mongering over crime that we're seeing right now. Mm-hmm. Because without a doubt, crime is down, but also homelessness has gone up over the past few years. There is a distinct rise in homelessness. Now, being homeless is not a crime, and people who are homeless are no more likely to commit crime than anyone else. In fact, they're more likely to be the victim of violent crimes than be the ones to commit violent crimes. But people see homeless people, housed people see homeless people, and they feel unsafe. So then they they correlate that immediately with crime. And so that I really do think, and then that's why we probably see this. I'm seeing this everywhere. Mainstream media is going wild with this. I heard on like the radio, like one of the morning zoo shows the other day, the whole squatting issue, which has been a thing forever. First of all, squatters, there is no squatters' rights law in New York. There are tenant laws, and a lot of times these people who are squatting claim to have tenants' rights, and that's why they're protected. There's no like actual like squatters' rights in New York, at least. There should be, but
to the extent they exist anywhere, it's because the alternative is brutality that people actually can't fathom, even in like bygone years. Like that's why squatters' laws exist in like England or whatever. It's because like otherwise you just can't. because we're so used to enforcing, like, bending society towards the capitalist needs now that we can't even fathom how these sorts of rights could have ever been enshrined for people that just need shelter.
I mean, even the phrasing, squatters versus tenants' rights, but they're one and the same. It's just one is used to say, look at this delinquent over here.
Well, I mean,
I think though, if someone owns a property that's dilapidated and have had no upkeep to it, and it's harming the neighborhood or the greater good of the people who live in the surrounding area, and it's like this for like a decade in some cases, like then the city should take the local municipality should take over and say, we are taking this property from you. You are delinquent on it. You don't care for it. We do that with other things. Like you should not be able to, like someone who wants to live there and actually care for it should be able to take it over after a certain period of time.
Yeah, I mean, just to your point, Matt, I think that the squatter thing is just a concerted moral panic to make the homeless moral panic wasn't being inflamed enough. And so now the implication is that they're going to break into your home. Like you're going to go away on vacation and they're going to break into your home and they're going to squat in your home while you're out like in Turks and Caicos. And then when you come back, like, well, these squatter laws, they're not going to be able to get them out. They're going to have trash the place. And it's to make, homeless people seem even more dangerous, or to give this new edge to them that will make it easier for what I can only assume are like landlords essentially, tenants, landlords associations in places like Florida, real estate groups to like kick you out of your home when you miss like one payment, like because you're now suddenly a squatter.
So we have a relevant piece of sound here. I saw Hassan react to this because I think this guy's a Hassan fan. Purple Pingers, Jordan Vandenberg in Australia. And we're going to go a little bit long here, but this is a really great segment. It introduces the sort of story here, and then he debates these guys. So we'll watch this.
Well, with Australia in the grips of a housing crisis, one determined housing advocate / TikTok star has made it his mission to help put a roof over people's heads. Over the weekend, his mission got the attention of Americans, many of whom now say he needs to be dead.
Just a public service announcement for any rich people who live in a rich suburb and land banking an empty house. Just remember to change the lock.
This is housing advocate Purple Pingers, aka Jordan Vandenberg, and he's got a message for the owners of some of Australia's roughly 136,000 empty homes.
Homes are for people to live in, not for rich people to make money off.
Late last week, Mr. Pingers let the internet know he was collecting the addresses of vacant properties through his website.
There's a link
which will let you submit just a little bit. I'm sorry, I don't want us to get a copyright strike.
Full of set addresses.
Well, I want to say this guy whips ass
before deleting.
This guy kicks ass. This guy's awesome. Critical support for Jordan.
Actually, skip ahead to the interview, Bradley. We'll get right into it. But I mean, just the point here is like these are houses that are just left vacant. They're not. Nobody's allowed to move in because the people who own it aren't allowed to get enough of a return from the people who would be tenants of it. So they just are left there. And he points out, like, if I have zero interest, and particularly using my platform to say, like, oh, the people that are holding these houses vacant, we should be supporting them. No, absolutely not. Go ahead, Bradley. Skip to the.
Yeah, I mean, and to what Brandon was saying earlier as well, so much of this media, basically pro landlord propaganda is pushed by these real estate groups and these landlord associations in the same way that the organized retail theft headlines were pushed by real estate or by what do you call it? Retail organizations and the National Retail Federation, I believe it's called. And then you find out that, those numbers were completely fugazi and they made them up to cover up the fact that they opened like a Target store in an area that didn't have enough business. And so then they blamed it on shoplifting. I do want
to say, like, it's what's really amazed me about this whole discourse about the squatters and everything is that, like, I've seen, like, if you're a tenant, which a large portion of this country is, if you're a tenant, why the fuck do you care about this? Like, why do I see people who are renters or tenants out there, or even someone who owns a single fucking home and that's their residence where they live? Why do you care about this? It does not affect you. It will never affect you.
Binder, it's a four-letter word, C-U-C-K.
you are literally hurting laws that are established to actually protect you, the renter or tenant. Like, it is absolutely ridiculous. Like, I saw someone in the chat say, like, yeah, you won't, the live chat on YouTube. Yeah, like, but if you owned a property and this happened to you, you'd think differently. Well, guess what?
Yeah, that's
I will
addressed.
never own a second property, and this will never
Right.
happen. I'll never, first of all, I don't know if I'll ever own a single property, but I'll never for sure own a second property. This will never happen to me.
Exactly.
So why the hell would I care that someone who's unhoused finds an empty, uncared for home and is living in it temporarily? You know, if the homeowner comes and wants to take it back, they have to go through the legal process. Oh, no, but guess what? They'll most likely get it back. Like, this is absolutely ridiculous for anyone who's a working class or middle class who even owns a single home and no more to care about this. It is absolutely, and I think the stat is, in this country, I think like 1 or 2 million out of 360 million or whatever live in this country own more than one home. Like, give me a break. That this is a major issue that people are caring about in this country. This is literally the issue. Like, you're fighting for the upper class who would never fight for you. There's the same thing about, like, caring about the tax rate on people, on the multimillionaires, because what if someone who makes less than six figures one day becomes a multimillionaire? Give me a break.
It's just the same resentment, though, when student loans get forgiven. I had to pay my dues, and you don't have to pay your dues. You should have to pay your dues too and go through this. It's just like the literal, it's what the ruling class always says. It divides people along these lines and then pretends as if it's some sort of big problem.
This is addressed in this interview here that I want to get to, but Butthole says in the chat, who has a number 45 on their icon, love seeing broke people that can't afford a house in the first place pretend that squatting isn't a real issue. No, it's a real issue for people like you. For us, it's fine.
Well, joining us now is Purple Pingers himself. It's Jordan. G'day, Jordan. Look, I know we're in a pretty serious housing crisis, but do you really think that encouraging people to squat on private property is the way to fix it?
Yeah, look, let me answer your question by asking you another question. Do you think it's right that we have thousands of vacant, abandoned homes while we have people living on the street?
No, I don't. But is this the right way to handle it, though? I mean, shouldn't we be focused on policy?
Yeah, I think there's definitely room to focus on policy, but what do we do in the meantime when people are on the street while we're focusing on policy?
You use the word abandoned. Who owns a house and abandons it, Jordan?
Many people. I don't know if you've ever gone down the street and seen like houses empty for decades, but I certainly have.
I haven't.
No.
Oh, really? Interesting.
No.
How many, do you have any abandoned investment properties, Steve?
No, I don't. But, I mean, I'm just trying to get to the economics of this. If someone buys a property, I mean, yes, we've had land banking, obviously, from foreigners, but that's not widespread. There's not thousands of them.
On the census night, we had 10% of all housing stock vacant. But like, I asked people for less than 48 hours and I've already got over 300 responses. I'm not the government, so I don't have the resources to ask everyone. But yeah, if you've got like over 300 places that have been abandoned for more than 2 years, some up to 20 years, I think it's a problem that exists.
Thank you for clarifying. You are not indeed the government, Jordan. I appreciate that. So you put this up. Are people actually moving into these homes?
Yes. Not from the public ones, though.
So not from the ones you've listed?
Yeah.
So it's happening, privately, word of mouth or something?
Yeah. Like if someone needs a house, they can reach out to me and I can send them an empty home.
What sort of people are moving into these homes? You're seeing families with kids and...
It's mainly people just experiencing housing insecurity, and that can look like anyone.
Do they hook the house up to electricity, power, gas?
Haven't asked them.
So they're just basically camping out in abandoned homes with no power.
Yeah, I guess it's raining in Melbourne at the moment, so I guess camping out inside is probably better than camping out in a bush.
What about the idea that you might be encouraging people to, break the locks and move into a property? I mean, you say you don't do that, but if someone finds out from you, Jordan, that this house in this street's vacant, has been for 2 years, and it is locked, how do you know they're not going to go around there and bust the lock and get in?
I'm definitely not advocating that anyone breaks into...
I know you're not advocating it, but how do you know it's not going to happen?
Well,
squatting's legal, breaking and entering is not legal, and I think that's where I'd leave it.
You also say good people disobey bad laws.
Certainly, yeah.
So is that one of those bad laws you would want them to disobey?
No comment while eat.
Well, you can say no comment, but it's kind of the heart of the matter, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think this is a pretty big ethical question that we need to ask ourselves. And we've got the government promising a couple houses in a decade or two from now, while we have people living on the street and empty homes. And I think we've got adverse possession laws in Australia, and we've got squatting is legal in Australia. So what's the solution? I think it's staring at us.
Well, how'd you like to have someone squat in your place that you own?
It's not vacant, nor is it an investment property. So
you understand my question, don't you?
Yeah, it's a stupid one.
Yeah, it's a bad
It's irrelevant.
But that was my
point. If someone's living somewhere and they break and enter and go inside, that is not squatting. That's something completely different. It's a stupid question.
Yeah, no, this is but that's what I intended by they're trying to convince everybody that if you leave your house for even 10 minutes, that people are going to move in. And it's maybe if you live in the West Bank and they're Israeli settlers, they will, but but in countries that respect laws around housing, that probably won't happen. But in these cases, they're trying to convince it could happen to anybody, when this is just a problem for landlords who are leaving properties vacant because they can't rent it at the levels that they want to rent it at. People who bought houses during the record low inflation and they want to flip them, but the price for housing is it's a buyer's market now. So they're waiting and sitting on these houses for years because they've been over renovated, or they exist in places like suburbs of Phoenix where no one wants to live because it's 130 degrees outside. And this country has a oversupply of houses that are empty at this point.
Yeah. And I mean, all those speculative properties, yes, they're second properties often purchased by capitalists, but what we're seeing in this country in particular is these massive financial firms that are gobbling up housing in different areas and then reselling them for profit as well, and sitting on them as they accumulate in value, which should be illegal. But just to give you a sense of how tilted the laws are in favor of landowners versus tenants. Go ahead, Brandon.
I was gonna say, but if you look at realtor TikTok or landlord TikTok or HGTV shows, you can imagine that it's just a cute young couple in their 20s who are buying a cheap house in a neighborhood, and they're flipping it, and they're gonna use that money to pay for their kids' college, and this is so they can have financial freedom. But that's just not the actual story of vacant homes in America. The actual story is, like you said, private investment firms buying them up and leaving them empty.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, the solution to you needing to pay for your kids' college isn't to hold properties vacant until you find somebody that can pay it to where it's profitable for you. People who are in here saying you don't know what it's like to have. I do not care. Yeah, that is not my problem. That's not a problem.
I wouldn't buy 3 houses.
I think we should take that problem off you by after that property being vacant for a certain amount of time, that is public property. That's where I'm at. So I think we need to be clear about this, about how much you get nothing if you hold properties vacant. I do not care. This is not our problem. This is not the problem of working people in general. That's a specific problem to you. You made a bad investment.
Exactly. All right, guys, no more time for calls. I'm sorry. We're just going to read some IMs and get out of here. Dave from Jamaica, lots of these capitalist fans would be very sad to hear Adam Smith's view on rent-seeking and passive income.
The unacknowledgedly based sometimes, Adam Smith.
Squat, please, says, Matt is so on point, but I am a tenant and have been for 6 years. 2 months back, I bought my first and only property, but will move in only after retirement, as it is my hometown where I can't work from. Should I be concerned due to a rise in squatting?
Is it vacant?
Well, there's not really a rise in squatting. It's no more or less than, unless someone, I don't think there's been any stats on this. Again, a great point made out in that clip that we aired is that they have no idea that people are squatting because how many people are squatting, because unless the owner of the home actually ends up going over there, they never find out.
And
Right,
rent
exactly.
it. If you have a property, then I don't understand.
Rent it out.
Rent it out for somebody, and you can also make money off of that,
Right.
which is good for you and good for the person.
Like
and
the idea that you should just be able to put a lock on it for 5 years when you're ready for it. Like, no, maybe you should sell it in the meantime or something else. Like you can't, keeping properties vacant is just not acceptable.
Yeah.
Like, and rent it out to somebody, even if it's for cheaper than you want it to. I don't know. Like it's a problem, but like, again, this sort of thing.
Also, your problem is a very specific problem that,
Right.
again, we can't piecemeal policy to deal with like something that protects like the smallest percentage of people, the group of people who bought a house 5 years before they're going to retire, but they need to stay where they're renting currently. I mean, I understand this is a problem for you, but it's just not a broad issue facing
for society,
the vast majority of people.
Yeah.
You could hire a caretaker to check on the property once every couple of weeks. I believe a squatter needs to stay in there for 30 days to have rights in terms of being able to be considered a quote unquote tenant, I believe. So you just need someone to go in and make sure everything's looking good. If you care for the property too, no one's going to think it's
But you should probably visit it every once in a while.
People are just concerned
Right, yeah.
trolling. Like these aren't real concerns. Like buying a house 10 years before you move into it and no one occupies it forever. This sort of like intermittently occupied vacation home that you only visit every 3 years. Like this isn't happening. Americans can barely afford one house. That's why we're in this problem. So the 3 people who can afford 7 and want to like go through flipping them,
Fizzy Drink says, are landlords keeping properties vacant because they can't get the desired rent? Wouldn't it at least mitigate the cost of owning it? Honest question. It's the fair question. The landlords, are, I think, less of the problem in this particular instance. Like the housing that he's referring to are speculative homes, properties that people are holding on to until they can get the right price, and it keeps going up and up in value because of housing insecurity.
Probably a lot owned by the banks, frankly.
Yeah, and if it would mitigate the cost of owning it, yes, but they probably don't have a desire to rent it out. They're using it purely as speculation.
And let's just address when they talk about, well, isn't policy better? Do my Australian accent. Like policy would be better, but the people who run politicians are these same landlords. They own politicians and they don't want them buying so much housing that all of a sudden there's extra demand and it's cutting into the value that they are able to extract from people from when there's not a whole lot of supply. There's more supply, and so all of a sudden the demand is being met by publicly built housing. That's their worst nightmare. So it's a conspiracy.
Well, that's why we haven't built federally funded affordable housing has not been built since the 90s. Because
despite Howard Schultz coming up in it.
Yep.
I will say what the IMR said though, in terms of retail property in New York City, that is exactly what goes on. That's why there's so much empty space in Manhattan in terms of like places for people to go, restaurants, things like that, because these real estate companies try to get an entire building that they own to be vacated by all like the many stores or companies that are in it. And then once it's completely empty, they wait it out until some big, chain or corporate brand comes in to rent out the whole thing because they know they can get a shit ton more from that company. That's why you see so many banks in Manhattan, because they're able to afford prices that, restaurants and other places that people actually want to go to can't afford to rent for.
Haymarket said landlords who use unused homes can write off the loss on their buildings of the taxes on their taxes. So owning unused housing is still a positive for a company with lots of buildings. Great point.
That's the thing is like, that's why we say like, this is not our problem. You're already sorted out by politicians. They are looking after you like crazy right now. It's everybody who wants to affordably pay and not pay a quarter of half of their paycheck to, frankly, a group of people that don't do a whole lot.
Your left testicle says, how concerned should I be about all the white people living on my family's ancestral land? Can I do something about that? I'd love some anti-squatting laws to deal with my very specific problem.
These damn squatters.
I know. Who is you says, fundamentally, I'm beginning to believe that we need a market crash in housing for all these things to be corrected because our governments won't do it. Every house around me is easily overvalued by $100,000. Well, the Biden administration could start, or the Fed could start by freaking lowering some of these interest rates, by the way, which have been, it's been, well past due for the Fed to do such a thing. But
you need price controls with that too, because that means cheaper money for people to speculate houses with.
Yeah.
So like you need we really need to be more aggressively regulating housing in this country.
Yeah, I mean, and
I will say, like even like rent though, like I remember not that long ago, like when I was started renting like over a decade ago, affordable housing in New York City was considered to be like in the, upper three figures, low four figures. Like, you would apply to the housing lottery, and for affordable housing, and the prices start at like $1,000, $1,200 for like a 1-bedroom or something like that, which is doable. Now, if you look at those lotteries and what the starting affordable housing prices are, they're in like the 2000s. That's the starting point for affordable housing for a single individual. It is insane.
In part
that's not
because
even
of the
doable.
But that's in part because the federal government hasn't funded it in 25 years or in 20 years or whatever. Like that's because of the Faircloth Amendment, which when AOC joined Congress in 2018, she and Bernie, or maybe it was 2020, I forget when she did it, but they were trying to revive efforts to repeal it, and that would be a huge place to start because that's a federal moratorium on federal money going to affordable housing, and that's a huge driver. And the whole speculative industry is out of control. Anyway, JR in Philly said one of my favorite 30 Rock lines is when Dennis Duffy says, "You can't kick me out. I love you, and I have squatters' rights." Liz says, "Which is it? Do you love me or do you have squatters' rights?" And he says, "I don't see why they're mutually exclusive." That's the guy. He's one of the best characters. The Beeper King, Dennis Duffy.
Yeah.
One of her. Her.
Yeah, the guy from the insurance commercials.
Yeah, the guy from all the Allstate mayhem and the Allstate commercials.
Yeah, her ex-boyfriend who's always returning. Schwing State says people clutch pearls about crime in every city. I used to bartend in the downtown area of my town, and I have several people tell me that they can't go downtown without getting stabbed anymore. And I didn't have the heart to tell them that they were, in fact, downtown at that very moment, not being stabbed. I know.
Well, maybe they meant something different by downtown.
Ew. That's such a, what are you, in, 1975 Manhattan, calling, the black area of the city downtown? What the hell are we talking about here?
People from the suburbs are, and I know this because I lived in North Dakota, Bismarck, which is basically like a suburb without a city. Like some pathologies form about.
Oh yeah.
I mean, yeah, I think living in the suburbs definitely drives you crazy, and a lot of this is cope too. Like it's like it's a mix of people who are afraid of black people in crowds moving to the suburbs, and then people who don't want to be there coping because it's it takes me 55 minutes to drive to the nearest grocery store and get milk, but at least I have to deal with all the crackheads. And you're like, okay, sure, Jeff.
All right, 5 more and then we'll get out of here. Fetterman's blood clot says, "I'm actually really worried about anti-Semitism growing exponentially if Israel drags us into what will be a deeply unpopular war with Iran, who could shut down the majority of the global oil supply." I agree. I am deeply concerned about a broader conflict.
And not just because of the obvious rise in anti-Semitism that would cause. I mean, apocalypse. We need to not have a regional war, and it's Biden, by supporting it for going this long and not putting his foot down on particularly, it's unbelievable that we're on this sort of precipice leading into an election.
Yep. Rob from Dedham, Sam Harris, he wants some fucking proportion. Look at the death tolls from any year of conflict between Israel and Palestine. No serious person thinks Hamas is a real threat, let alone worse than Nazis. Sam Harris was just doing the Israel isn't doing genocide because it's acting in defense. Hamas wants to genocide, so it's worse. Which should only work on very dumb people.
People still listening to Sam Harris.
Lemonhead said, "Hope the interview with Ronnie is on the best ofs at the end of the year. Very insightful and important context. Also will be funny to have a brief O.J. Simpson mention in there." Yes. Dragon Rider, let's be real. It's BlackRock 90% of the time, these concern trolling campaigns. Yep, 100%. Probable Claude says we need to put extremely high monthly taxes on vacant houses to the point where it's unfeasible to keep it for long if someone's not living in it.
There's your policy.
Make landlords desperate to find people to live in these houses. And the final I am of the day Congressional baseball fan. Update from Arizona. Sedona literally just passed an ordinance to legally allow car sleeping so that the minimum wage workers who make all the resorts and restaurants run could live somewhere. It's so dystopian. The rich can't even recognize that there's a problem that cannot continue indefinitely.
Jesus.
Oh my God. NJ Mailman said, did Israel just bomb a UNICEF convoy? I saw that before the show and I didn't have time to verify it, but
maybe tomorrow.
Or it was the UN one. It's hard to keep track. I mean, Jesus Christ. Anyway, appreciate you all. We went long today. Fun stuff, though. Check out Scam Economy, Doom. Check out the Discourse, Left Reckoning, ESPN. Appreciate you guys. We will see you
Leftist
tomorrow.
Mafia tonight.
Oh, Leftist Mafia tonight. See you tomorrow.
It might take all the strength I got to get to where I want, but I know somehow I'm gonna get